Hello historians and welcome back. Today we'll be looking at the life of Lady Jane Grey, the woman who would be known incorrectly as the 9-Day Queen. How Jane's reign has been handled over the years has always irked me, as she actually ruled for 13 days and she should be referred to as Queen Jane I, and yet she's become known as Lady Jane Grey, the 9-Day Queen, a much inferior title than what she deserves. But I will be covering that in the next video. For now, let's return to how she actually became Queen. Lady Jane Grey was born around October of 1537, presumably at her family home of Bradgate Park. Her date of birth puts her around the same age as her cousin, the future King Edward VI, and as Jane was part of the minor nobility, less of her life was documented than her cousin's. Jane was named after the Queen at the time of her birth, which was Edward's mother, Queen Jane Seymour, who would later die on the 24th of October, 1537. Jane's parents were Frances Brandon, the eldest daughter of Mary Tudor, Duchess of Suffolk, and Sir Henry Grey. Jane's father, Henry Grey, was the great-grandson of Queen Elizabeth I, wife of King Edward IV, and through her mother Frances Brandon, Jane was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII. Jane had been brought up a Protestant, like her cousins Edward and Elizabeth, the latter of whom she would share her education with at the home of the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr. Jane was intelligent. She studied Greek, Latin and Hebrew, and was fluent in French and Italian. Queen Elizabeth I is often praised for her educational studies. Jane's education was of an even higher standard than Elizabeth's, as Jane was the eldest of an all-female family, and she had two younger sisters, Catherine and Mary Grey, so Jane was expected to understand how to run the family estate. Jane's cousin, Edward Tudor, was crowned King Edward VI at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of February 1547. About a month later, the King's uncle, Thomas Seymour, who would secretly marry the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, tried to purchase Jane's wardship. As a Protestant girl with a formidable intellect that has a claim to the English throne, Jane was a marriage prize. Thomas Seymour had hoped by getting Jane's wardship he could arrange a marriage between the new king and Jane, a much better match than the one the Lord Protector was trying to arrange between the king and the Roman Catholic Elizabeth of France. Jane's father, Sir Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, was hesitant as he was unaware that Thomas Seymour had secretly married Catherine Parr and felt that Seymour was not capable to look after his daughter, nor was he in the position to arrange a match between her and the king. As a result, Jane was to stay at her family home. Jane's home life is often depicted as one of hardship and to an extent abuse, but I wonder how much of that is actually down to how Jane perceived her time there, as both her sisters Catherine and Mary seemed not to have any complaints about their upbringing. However, they were not as academically driven as Jane. Jane preferred academic studies rather than activities such as hunting parties, and allegedly regarded her strict upbringing, which was typical at the time, as harsh. Jane used books to escape her family, and I'm sure this is something that Jane and the Lady Elizabeth would have bonded over at their time at Catherine Parr's. The scholar Roger Ascham found Jane reading Plato. Apparently, she is said to have complained, "For when I am in the presence either of father or mother, whether I speak, keep silence, sit, stand, or go eat, drink, be merry or sad, be sewing, playing, dancing, or doing anything, I must do it as it were in such weight, measure, and number even so perfectly as God made the world. Or else I am so sharply taunted, so cruelly threatened, ye presently sometimes with pinches, nips and bobs, and other ways, which I will not name for the honour I bear them, that I think myself in hell." By February 1548, Thomas Seymour and Catherine Parr's marriage was public and Jane went to live in the household of the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr. It was common at the time for the nobility to send their children to other or higher status households to improve their education. The Lady Elizabeth was also present at the Dowager Queen's household at this time, and the two studied and had lessons together. Catherine herself was an intellectual who was praised for her academic achievements, and was also a strong Protestant influence. Catherine held her own court, which meant the young Jane and Elizabeth would have been exposed to Catherine's like-minded friends, like Mildred Cecil and Catherine Brandon, the Duchess of Suffolk. Both Mildred and Catherine Brandon were strong-minded, just like Catherine Parr, and this is also evident in Jane's other cousin, the Lady Mary. So it is only natural that Jane inherited this family trait, something that the Privy Council failed to see when they thought that they could use her as a puppet queen. In the summer of 1548, Catherine Parr went to Sudeley Castle to make preparations for her first birth. Jane accompanied Catherine to Sudeley. Elizabeth, on the other hand, had left Catherine's household due to her shenanigans with Catherine's husband Thomas. The two women spent a lot of time together, and Catherine was fond of Jane. And Catherine had reconciled with her stepdaughter Mary, who had originally disapproved of her marriage to Thomas, but was over it when she found out that Catherine was pregnant. Mary had written to Catherine to tell her that she was going to Norfolk. Catherine Parr gave birth to a girl on the 30th of August 1548, who she named Mary after her stepdaughter. However, Catherine was very weak after the birth. She had succumbed to a fever, and each day she became more and more delirious, where she spoke about her husband's adultery and betrayal, which was troubling her, and she no longer had the strength or wit to hide it. Catherine Parr died on the 7th of September 1548 at Sudeley Castle between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m. Her husband Thomas was distraught at his wife's death. Young Jane Grey shed tears, as Catherine had been a better mother to her than her own, although you could look at it from the point of view that she was crying because she might have to return to Bradgate. Jane became Thomas Seymour's ward in the absence of Catherine, and Jane was also chief mourner at the Dowager Queen's funeral. However, Jane would eventually return to Bradgate Park, as her father, Henry Grey, was worried about her moral character, after hearing the rumours of Seymour and the Lady Elizabeth, and was concerned how his daughter would develop without a female figure in her life. This, however, wasn't his only motive for his daughter to return home, as Henry Grey was also trying to arrange a marriage between Jane and the Lord Protector's son, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. When Jane had returned home, she wrote to her former ward, Thomas Seymour, and thanked him for all such good behaviour as she'd learned by the Queen's most virtuous instruction. It is clear that Jane had enjoyed the time that she'd spent with Thomas and Catherine. Thomas Seymour was to be executed on the 20th of March 1549 for shooting the King's dog. Right. An alleged attempted kidnapping. In what world did he think he was going to get away with that? Jane's father, Sir Henry Grey, was made the Duke of Suffolk in 1551. As a result of his elevation in status, he spent more time at court. On the 4th of November 1551, the Lady Jane, along with Margaret Douglas, the daughter of Margaret Tudor and Jane's great aunt, and Mary Howard, the widow of Henry VIII's illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy, all welcomed the Dowager Queen of Scotland, Mary of Guise, to England. She stopped through as she was travelling back to France. Mary of Guise was the mother of Mary Queen of Scots. The 22nd of January 1552 saw the execution of Thomas Seymour's brother, who up until now had been the Lord Protector for King Edward VI, who was now old enough to not need a replacement. Edward Seymour's steady fall from power is probably what held up the marriage negotiations between Jane and Seymour's eldest son, who was also called Edward Seymour, and as a result, this marriage never materialised. Instead, Jane married Lord Guilford Dudley on the 21st of May 1553 at Durham House. What made this wedding so extravagant was the fact that it was a three-way wedding, as Jane's sister Catherine Grey wed the Earl of Pembroke, Lord Herbert, and Guilford's sister, Catherine Dudley, married Henry Hastings, the heir to the earldom of Huntingdon. At the same time, Jane described herself as a wife who loves her husband, and she admitted that she resented her mother-in-law, the Duchess of Northumberland's control over her husband Guilford, which is understandable, but both Jane and Guilford were teenagers, so I can understand if Guilford was still a mummy's boy. King Edward VI, however, was on his sickbed. He had wished to attend his cousin's wedding, but he was too ill to do so. To compensate for his absence, he provided lavish clothes for the wedding. It is believed that Jane didn't want to get married, but she said that it felt as if it was her duty, and she wanted to obey her parents. If you view Jane as having an abusive relationship with her parents, you could see this as Jane being scared of her parents and complying out of fear. Some sources say that Jane even questions the legality of her marriage, as she thought that she had been pre-contracted to the son of Edward Seymour. Despite what she might have thought, Guilford would be her husband until her death. So, like many Tudor women, she was stuck. Although I don't know if I buy this, because in her prayer book, which she hands the executioner before she's executed, spoiler alert, she actually wrote a message to her father, and she signed it as Jane Dudley. She wouldn't have signed that as Jane Dudley if she didn't truly think that Guilford was her lawful husband. But anyway, Jane's father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, along with the Privy Council, was determined to keep the country Protestant, as well as the religious reforms that had been in place. If the country was Protestant, everyone knew where they stood, and would have none of the uncertainty that happened under the reign of Edward's father, King Henry VIII. Edward too wanted to keep the country Protestant, but everyone knew that if Edward's current heir, his sister Mary, became queen, she would convert the country back to Catholicism. Next in line after Mary was Edward's other sister, Elizabeth, who was Protestant. However, Edward viewed her as illegitimate, and above all, Edward wanted a male heir. In the 16th century, women were seen as creatures of emotion rather than logic, and were seen as incapable of ruling a country. Edward's last will of succession was transformative, as it's through his act of succession that we get our first queen regnant. Although, not in the way that people would think. None of Edward's surviving heirs were male. Mary was 37 and unmarried, so was unlikely to have children. Elizabeth was 19 and unmarried, and a more favourable choice. His next option was to look through the lines of his aunties. His auntie Margaret had a son who was the King of Scotland, but he had died, leaving his young daughter and Edward's former fiancée, in the loosest of terms, as Queen of Scotland. Henry VIII had made it clear in his will that he did not want a member of the Scottish royal family on his throne. This left Edward's other auntie, Mary Tudor, who had died in 1536. Mary had two daughters, Frances and Eleanor, both of whom had female children. The eldest daughter, Frances, was the mother of Lady Jane Grey, who was married to the son of the Duke of Northumberland. Northumberland at this point had taken control of the Privy Council and the line of succession, as Edward VI's health was rapidly failing. It was agreed, although how much involvement Edward had is debatable, that the line of succession would skip Edward's sisters and would go to Lady Frances Grey and her heirs. Northumberland fired Edward's doctor for a wise woman who gave the king arsenic. This then caused the king further pain. Lady Frances stepped down in favour of her daughter Jane, who was married and would potentially have children soon. The devise of the succession originally read, "The Lady Jane's heirs male," but with time running out and the king reaching ever so closer to death, it was apparent that Edward would not be around long enough to see Jane conceive children. So, the document was edited. 2 extra words in Edward's handwriting was added, and her. So the document now read, "The Lady Jane and her heirs male." These 2 little words put Jane as next in line, and not just as regent until she had children. This coincidentally benefited Northumberland as well, as he was now the father-in-law of the Queen of England, and the father of the King Consort of England. Or so he thought. With that in mind, he sacked the wise woman and got the doctor to return in hopes of saving the young king. Jane was unaware that she was even included in the line of succession, as everyone assumed, including her, it would go to Mary and then Elizabeth. And she was definitely not aware of the and her. King Edward VI died on the 6th of July 1553. According to John Fox, his last words were, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me and take my spirit." The Lady Mary is summoned to court by Northumberland on the pretence of seeing her brother, but Mary is tipped off at court and flees to one of her estates. Apparently, at some point in 1553, Lady Jane Grey was walking through a building that had once been a monastery. Suddenly, a blood-stained hand shot at her through a gap in the wall, waving an axe dripping in blood. An avenging monk wanted to scare the Tudor lady away from the building, but Lady Jane didn't run. Not sure how true that story is, but I feel like it makes a fun Halloween thing, you know? As I covered in the previous video, Jane was born on around October 1537 to Francis and Henry Grey. Through her father, Jane was the great-great-granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth Woodville, because Queen Elizabeth Woodville had 2 children from her previous marriage before she married the king, and Jane descends from one of those 2 children. And through her mother, she was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII. We learnt in the last episode that Jane had married Guilford Dudley, the son of the Duke of Norfolk. As King Edward VI lay dying, Northumberland steered the king into changing the line of succession, so his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, were skipped, and instead, Northumberland's daughter-in-law and Edward's cousin Jane would conveniently be queen instead. King Edward VI died on the 6th of July 1553 at Greenwich Palace. Once a monarch has died, their successor starts their reign from then on, unless you're King Henry VII, where you're precocious enough to start the date of your reign as the day before the battle that actually got you the crown in the first place. But he's the exception, we ignore him. King Edward VI died on the 6th of July. Therefore, Jane's reign starts on the 6th of July, as the Privy Council knew prior to Edward's death who his successor would be, and that's how monarchy works. We saw the same recently with Queen Elizabeth II. She died on the 8th of September 2022, and Prince Charles became King Charles III upon her death on the 8th of September 2022. Despite the fact, as writing this, that the king hasn't had his coronation, he is still King Charles III, although his coronation, as the time of writing this, is actually going to be next month.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The palace has just issued this statement. It says the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening.
However, because history has a vendetta against Jane, her reign is always documented as the 10th of July 1553, 4 days later, which is where the 9 days queen comes from. But she did rule for 13 days, and there are so many boy kings in our history that did not have a coronation, the same as Jane, and yet they are still referred to as king. And yes, this bugs me.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me. It bothers me. It bothers me a lot. And that one's still green!
Hashtag justice for Jane. Hashtag 13-day queen. I'm going to start a YouTube revolution. You watch me. Oh my god, no, that sounds far too much work. Another snub is the fact that history remembers Jane as the Lady Jane Grey, not Queen Jane I, as she should be. However, she's not the only woman in history to face this prejudice. For example, Matilda, who should be the Empress Matilda or Queen Matilda I, also has the same issue. Hashtag Queen Jane I. 7th of July 1553, the day after Edward VI died, the Privy Council were very cautious, and they decided to hide the king's death from the public, as the country was vulnerable until a new monarch was secured. The Duke of Northumberland sent his son Robert Dudley, the future favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, and 300 soldiers to capture the Lady Mary before she could gather support for her claim to the throne. As she was the main competitor for the throne, she had the best claim, and it was the wish of her father, King Henry VIII, for Mary to succeed Edward if he didn't have any children. However, Mary already knew, as she'd been informed by those who were loyal to her, and she had fled to one of her estates. The common folk, who still believed that Edward was alive, were sure that Northumberland was trying to poison Edward. I mean, they weren't wrong. The guy did literally pay someone to give Edward arsenic.
All right, it was an accident, I swear. Phoebe, tell her.
Okay, I didn't see it because I was putting on my jacket, but I want to believe you.
But Northumberland tried to discredit Mary, saying that the last time Mary visited her brother, she had cast an evil spell on him. Mary was very popular at the time, and hardly anyone believed these outlandish claims. Word was getting out that the king was dying, but as we know, he was already dead. The attendants propped Edward up against the window to try and make it look like he was still alive. But the public was shocked to see that Edward's skinny body was so swollen. His fingers were turning black, and his hair had fallen out.
Gross.
I don't care how far away that window was, but if somebody's fingers have turned black and they've lost their hair, I don't understand how they thought that was going to pass. On the 8th of July 1553, the Duke of Northumberland secured the waterway near the Tower of London, and he moved loyal Protestants across the country. The movement of the Guards made it very obvious that the king had died, despite there being no official announcement, and Jane still had no idea that she was queen, or that she had been for the last 2 days. A bit like the rest of history. On Sunday the 9th of July 1553, Northumberland summons his daughter-in-law Lady Jane Grey to Syon Park House, the home of the Duke and Duchess of Northumberland. It is here that Jane was informed that she was now Queen of England. Jane expressed that it's not for her and that the rightful queen is Mary, a view that Jane was not alone in thinking. Reportedly, Jane cried, but this has been thought that she cried more for the death of her cousin the king, rather than her unwillingness to actually be queen. Jane's parents, Francis and Henry Grey, arrived at Syon House where they would pressure her into accepting the queenship. I'm assuming that the pressure came more from Henry, as Francis seemed to keep her nose clean later on, whereas Henry would quite literally die supporting his daughter's claim. Jane then acknowledges that it is God's will for her to be queen and accepts. Meanwhile, the Lady Mary wrote letters to influential landowners hoping that she would be able to get their support. On the 10th of July 1553, the day that is often attributed to the start of Jane's reign, Jane assumed the throne. She was proclaimed queen despite being fifth in line to the throne and ousting Edward's sisters, and Jane took a barge to the Tower of London. And many were shocked that her mother Frances Grey was carrying her daughter's train, as Frances had a better claim to the throne than Jane. But Jane was made queen through Northumberland's scheming, and Jane was married to his son, not Francis. Many had issue with Northumberland as he seemed confident and self-assured, and many saw Northumberland's plan to make his son king through Jane. I mean, it was
pretty obvious.
Jane was taken to the Tower, as it was England's stronghold, and it was believed that if you controlled the Tower, you controlled the power. Northumberland and the Privy Council rushed to secure the Tower of London, so Mary couldn't. The Tower of London at this point was a residency, a prison, and an armoury. Nobody rejoiced when Jane was announced by the heralds as queen, as was the case for new monarchs, but nobody dared to denounce her either. It was fairly neutral. I mean, one person did, but he had his ears nailed to a wall, and if he wanted to be set free, he had to repent, and the only way for him to be free was to have his ears chopped off. Northumberland was going to enforce Jane's reign through fear, and I bet you can guess how well that turned out. Interestingly enough, Jane was the first monarch to be announced through print. The publication was printed and handed out through the country. Edward's proclamation was a page long. Jane's proclamation was 3 pages long. The length of her proclamation compared to Edward's shows just how big of an uphill battle Jane was going to face in order to keep her queenship, as the proclamation justifies the line of succession. The Privy Council received a message from Mary to say support her cause and she will pardon them. But if you don't, you will face bloodshed. The Privy Council had a decision to make: abandon Jane or start a civil war. Mary also told the country that the religion of the country would not change much from her brother Edward's rule. This was obviously a lie just to gain support, which she would prove during her own reign. Submitting to Mary would also mean a loss of titles for most of the council. The council wrote a response to Mary and got Jane to sign the letter as Jane the Queen, a letter that would later be used as evidence for treason. The next day, on the 11th of July 1553, after the lack of enthusiasm of Jane's announcement as Queen, Northumberland sent people out into the streets to gather support, and an army. Mary, however, already had her army. The issue with Jane is, nobody knew who she was. Jane, although royalty, wasn't or hadn't been paraded to the public, nor did she frequent court as often as she probably needed to have done. So nobody knew who they were fighting for, nor did they really care. Whereas the Lady Mary had made public visits since she was a little girl. She frequented court regularly and was often seen out and about, which ultimately gave her the upper hand over Jane. While in the Tower of London alone, Jane tried on the crown to see what it felt like, what it would look like to be queen. When the Lord Treasurer asked Jane if he should have one made for Guilford Dudley, you know, the presumed king consort, Jane said no. Instead, Dudley would be made a duke and she would rule alone. Queen Elizabeth II actually made a similar decision when she became queen, creating Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, not king consort. This was a power play by both women, reminding the world that they are the one in charge, it's their throne by birthright, and in both cases, the husbands would have technically outranked their wives if they had been made king consorts. It was the same with Queen Anne and with Queen Victoria. The only queens in English history who have made their husbands king consorts were Queen Mary I and Queen Mary II. Mary I would have to get a prenup so her husband wouldn't assume the role of king after her death, and Mary II allowed her husband to rule after her. Guilford was furious that Jane would not make him king consort, and he played the only card he had. He withheld sex. For those of you that don't understand the significance of this, no sex means no baby. No baby means no heir. No heir means their rule is not secure. On the 12th of July, 1553, the Lady Mary is in East Anglia, as she owns land here and is gathering her support from the locals, with whom she is popular. You see, the monarchy didn't own an army, they relied on their subjects wanting to fight for them, which is why this fight for power is actually very much a popularity contest that Mary is winning. But the monarch could buy an army if they wanted to, which Jane unfortunately had to do. She even offered double the normal wage, but that still wasn't enough to dwindle Mary's supporters. Northumberland underestimated the size of Mary's army, and as the best soldier that they had, he was chosen to lead the military charge against Mary. It was originally Jane's father, Henry Grey, that was chosen, but he was very inexperienced and quite frankly lazy. Henry VIII knew this, which is why Henry Grey never got a dukedom till the reign of the inexperienced Edward VI. Unfortunately, with Northumberland away from London, there were no good politicians left to keep hold of the tower. Some historians see this as the crucial mistake that saw the downfall of Jane's reign. Later that day, Mary arrives at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk with an army and a huge cheer of support upon her arrival. The 13th of July 1553 was the day when most of the lords and nobles that supported Jane started to defect to Mary. Those who worked for the lords and nobles wanted to support Mary and started to be defiant, and so the landlords and nobles who supported Jane turned their allegiance to Mary out of fear of losing their power over their tenants. The next day, Jane asked for an inventory list to be made of everything valuable in the monarch's possession. On the 15th of July, Northumberland arrives at Cambridge, waiting for the rest of the artillery to arrive and surround Mary. Bad weather had forced his navy to seek shelter at a tavern, where they encountered a Mary sympathiser. The navy men told the man that they hadn't been paid by Northumberland, and so he convinces them to change sides and fight for Mary. The Privy Council heard of the Navy's mutiny the next day, and London was getting ready for an attack from Mary. Jane locked herself and her nobles in the Tower of London, and she requested that the keys be given to her, to prevent any of them from jumping ship. If Jane was going to go down, she was going to take the men that put her in this position with her, because remember, Jane never wanted to be queen. As Jane predicted on the 17th of July, the men from the Privy Council were getting itchy feet and wanted to abandon Jane. Northumberland's artillery finally arrives, but he doesn't know about the Navy mutiny. But the Privy Council does, and they declare Northumberland as a traitor and Mary as queen. None the wiser, Northumberland continues to Mary at Framlingham. He receives a letter telling him that Mary has more men, and now his navy, that he didn't pay for, is with her. Jane is abandoned by her uncle and the rest of the Privy Council. Jane then sets them free, with only her father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and her husband, Guilford Dudley, by her side. Jane's uncle, the Earl of Arundel, had backed Jane for monetary reasons, but as a Catholic abandoned Jane as soon as possible and used Northumberland as a scapegoat. When the Privy Council announced Mary as Queen in Cheapside, the street erupted in cheers of joy and bonfires were lit. Henry Grey removed the cloth of state from his daughter's head to show that she was no longer queen. Jane gave up the crown as readily as she has accepted it. She then turned to her father and said, "Can I go home now?" Jane was arrested and stripped of her valuables and placed in a small house on Tower Green. I think her asking to go home just shows how young and manipulated Jane was. We know that she was academically minded, but it also shows a young girl who doesn't understand the full extent of what she's just done. Jane has just usurped an heir. People have died for that. I mean, Jane ultimately would. I kind of feel like she was just a girl playing dress up or playing queen for a fortnight and was told, "You can't play this game anymore." And she's like, "Okay. I was getting bored anyway. It's not as fun as I thought it was." Jane's reign just shows the complexity of her character. You know, she makes these strong decisions like ruling alone and locking the Privy Council in with her because she knew they're not to be trusted. But then her immature words, like the ones just uttered. I don't know. Just let me know what you think about Jane in the comments below. The 19th of July, the Duke of Northumberland learnt that Mary was proclaimed Queen. So to save his own skin, he cried. He had not been born as a higher up, and he had fought his way to the top, and he was so close to making Jane Queen. On the night before his execution, he attended Catholic Mass in an attempt to save his life, but it didn't work. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, was beheaded for treason on the 22nd of August 1553. Although I have seen some sources that claim he was hung, drawn and quartered. So I guess you can choose which method you prefer, because at the end of the day, they both achieve the same result. Mary enters London on the 3rd of August 1553 with her sister Elizabeth at her side, who was oddly quiet in all of this, but maybe that was for the best. Jane blamed Northumberland for her family's troubles. At the beginning of Queen Mary I's reign, Jane and her father were committed to the Tower of London, but Henry Grey was soon pardoned. Jane and her husband Guilford were charged with high treason on the 14th of November 1553. Jane pleaded guilty and was sentenced to death. Mary, who wasn't as heartless as what you may think, began to feel sorry for her young cousin, and remembered Jane was about 16, and Mary, as we have seen with how she interacts with her sister Elizabeth, has a maternal side, and so she briefly suspended Jane's execution. But then, you guys, we have Sir Henry Grey.
Hello there.
He comes in and he just ruins everything. He couldn't have left it alone. You know, Mary's pardoned him. She's, decided to pause Jane's execution. She signed the death warrant, but she's like, maybe we won't do that at the moment. And so, in early 1554, Mary announced her plans that she was going to marry Philip of Spain, which was a very unpopular match. And to be honest, even Philip wasn't that thrilled. Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion in the February known as the Wyatt Rebellion.
Real original.
Which sought to depose Mary and replace her with her sister Elizabeth. The issue was that Jane's father, Henry Grey, was heavily involved in this rebellion. Elizabeth was placed in the Tower and interrogated, and then released on lack of evidence. But Jane wasn't so lucky. Despite Jane not being named as a potential replacement for Mary, Henry, Jane's father, his involvement was enough to send them both to the chopping block. Mary had forgiven Sir Henry Grey once, and she wasn't so generous to do it a second time. On the 12th of February 1554, Jane watched her husband, Guilford Dudley, being carried away to be executed from the window of her cell in the Tower of London, and 2 hours later, she would be dead. Henry Grey and Guilford Dudley would receive public executions, although Henry's would be on the 23rd of February. Jane would have a private execution on Tower Green within the grounds of the castle. Between 1483 and 1941, there would be 22 executions at the Tower of London, which actually, when you think about it, isn't that lot, considering the amount of people that were executed between that time period. Jane was one of 5 women, and one of 3 queens, the other 2 being Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Jane didn't flinch at seeing her husband's body, and she wore the same black dress that she wore when she was proclaimed queen. Jane carried her prayer book with her to the scaffold and handed it over just before she knelt for her beheading. Jane had written some messages in her prayer book. One of them is a heartfelt message to her father. She writes, "The Lord comforts your grace, that the word wherein all creatures can only be comforted. And thou it hath pleased God to take away 2 of your children. Yet think not that you have lost them, but trust that we, by living this mortal life, have won an immortal life. Your Grace's humble daughter, Jane Dudley." It is said that Jane died bravely, asking the executioner to please dispatch me quickly. It is believed that she tied her handkerchief around her eyes and felt for the block, asking where is it, and that someone guided her to the block. But many historians are now starting to dismiss this as a myth, or a flat-out fabrication added to make Jane's tragic story even more so. There is one eyewitness account written at the time of her execution. All other sources were written years, decades, and even centuries after her execution. Jane did reportedly say on the scaffold that she is not guilty of ambition, which is true. She never did seek the crown, but equally she didn't refuse it. Also, let's talk about this infamous Delaroche painting that depicts Jane's execution, which probably inspired the myth about her fumbling hopelessly for the block. Do I think it's an accurate representation of what happened? No. I mean, if you don't have anything nice to say about something, then obviously you're better off not saying it, and that applies to everything, whether it's people, works of art, YouTube comments. So I will say something nice about the painting. He did a good job of the straw. I think he painted that very well, and I think there might have been straw at the execution. I cannot say anything else about the painting, because I just think it creates so many more problems. Jane's father, Sir Henry Grey, as I said, was executed on the 23rd of February 1554. His head fell into sawdust that was steeped in tanning. Because of this, his head was preserved like leather and was put on show until the 1940s. The head was then finally buried in London, about a mile away from his 400-year-old body. Mary was born on the 18th of February 1516 at Greenwich Palace to King Henry VIII and his first wife and Queen Catherine of Aragon. The Princess Mary was the fifth child of the King and Queen, but was the only one to survive infancy. Mary's birth was a mixture of joy and disappointment. Henry was disappointed that she was not the male heir that he had been after, but her birth did prove that her mother Catherine was capable of producing a healthy baby, to which the optimistic Henry said, "If it was a daughter this time, by the grace of gods the son will follow." Henry was fond of his daughter, and he often showed her off to visiting dignitaries, calling her a right lusty princess. Her mother Catherine was maternal and very protective of her. When Catherine had led Mary by the hand into Henry's presence, he would swoop his daughter up in his arms and carry her round, bursting with pride, and Mary would adore her father. This very loving family unit is a far cry from the disjointed Tudor family we are often used to hearing about. Mary was baptised on the 21st of February at the Church of the Observant Friars in Greenwich, and her godparents were Thomas Wolsey, her great-aunt Catherine of York, and Agnes Howard, the Duchess of Norfolk, the very same Duchess who failed to protect Catherine Howard, and Margaret Parr, Countess of Salisbury, who would become Mary's governess in 1520. At the age of 2, Mary was promised to the Dauphin of France. Henry VIII was enthusiastic about the match, as it would mean that his daughter would be the future Queen of France. Catherine was not happy about her only child being given to France, the sworn enemy of Spain, but she did not openly criticise. Fortunately for Catherine, Thomas Wolsey managed to break off Mary's engagement on the 14th of July 1520, as Henry signed a new treaty with Spain. This would lead to Charles V coming to England in May 1522 for a betrothal ceremony to the Princess Mary. The ceremony took place on the 19th of June, and it was agreed that Mary would go to Spain when she turned 12. Charles wanted Mary to go to Spain early to learn how to be a Spanish princess. However, Henry, I'm sure at the insistence of Catherine, put his foot down and said no. A mistress to bring up her after the manner of Spain? Then I could not find one more meet than the Queen's Grace, her mother. 3 years later, Charles V invaded France, and King Henry VIII praised Charles on his victory and sent him an emerald ring on Mary's behalf with a loving message. Charles pressed once more for the Princess Mary to come to Spain, but Henry was adamant that she would not go until the agreed age of 12. Charles then asked for her dowry. I imagine Henry laughed at this request on the basis that it was not due for about another 3 years. A rather frustrated Charles broke off the engagement in the August of 1525 as he had not received his bride or her dowry. He had also been offered a better match, with Catherine's niece Isabella of Portugal, who was older than Mary, so she could provide him children, and she had a bigger dowry. At this point, Mary's mother Catherine had already entered the menopause, and it was clear that the couple weren't going to have any other children. Henry had one illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, who Henry recognised and considered legitimising after the break with Spain. Henry VIII even considered marrying Mary to her half-brother Henry Fitzroy, but Henry wasn't sure how the public would receive this. As his only legitimate child, Henry sent Mary to Ludlow Castle in 1525, as was the tradition with those that held the Prince of Wales title, like his brother Arthur had done with Catherine of Aragon in 1501/1502. Although Mary did not hold the title of Princess of Wales, despite being her father's heir and being entitled to it, he relocated her to Ludlow Castle. This was still making a statement that she was the heir apparent, without really committing to it. Mary was given her own court and household, and by the age of 9, Mary could read and write in Latin. She studied French, Spanish, music, dance, and Greek. In the summer of 1526, King Francis I of France offered himself as a suitor for the Princess Mary, as his wife Queen Claude had died in 1524. Just like the previous French alliance, Henry was thrilled, Catherine not so much, and nothing came with this proposal either. It was around this time that Mary's parents' marriage would start to break down. Henry would claim that he hadn't shared a bed with Catherine since 1524, and Henry had now realised he wasn't okay with having a daughter as his heir. He did care about having a boy, and so 1527 would usher in the king's great matter, where he tries to divorce Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon. Mary came to Greenwich Palace for Christmas, and Catherine was delighted to see her daughter, as she had not seen her since the April of that year. But Mary would return to Ludlow Castle at the end of the festive season, and would not return to court again until April 1527, shortly after her father had proposed to Anne Boleyn. Mary didn't like Anne, understandably, as she was the other woman who broke down her father's marriage, and Anne also wasn't a fan of Mary, and would treat her and her mother Catherine with great harshness, which would only increase once Anne had had a daughter of her own. Francis would return with another marriage offer, but this time for his second son, the Duke of Orleans. The marriage treaty between Mary and the Duke was ratified in May 1527, only for Francis to then become betrothed to Emperor Charles V's sister Eleanor, and then chicken out, which meant Mary was now single again.
Oh, behave! Yeah!
October 1528, a rumour was spread that Anne Boleyn had convinced King Henry VIII to arrange a marriage between the Princess Mary and the Duke of Norfolk's son, Henry, Earl of Surrey. By having Mary marry a member of her family, Anne Boleyn would be able to control her future stepdaughter. It would have also ensured that no foreign groom would claim the princess in the future. By 1530, Mary was aware of the feud between her parents, and this would also be the start of her ill health that would plague her for the rest of her life. And there is no doubt that her painful and irregular periods, depression, excruciating headaches, stress and anxiety were caused by her parents' feuding. In early March of 1531, her mother Catherine learnt that Mary hadn't kept food down for a week and wanted to go see her daughter to make sure that she was okay. Henry agreed that she could go, but if she did, she should also stop there. Catherine, although desperate to see her daughter, did not want to potentially sabotage her daughter's position, as her illegitimacy at this point was being called into question, as was Catherine's marriage to Henry. It was in Mary's best interest to be seen as a legitimate daughter of the king. So despite her maternal instincts, Catherine stayed by Henry's side. Mary loved both of her parents, but she now rarely saw either of them, and she started to side with her mother. And in her loneliness, Mary turned to religion. Again, this is a far cry from the loving family unit that was described at the beginning of this episode. By the 24th of March 1531, Mary still hadn't recovered, and Henry is now concerned about his only child.
Don't make me come up there and be a parent! First time for everything! Ho ho ho!
And he was also starting to feel guilty about not allowing his daughter to receive motherly love, so he arranged for Mary to be brought by litter to Richmond Palace, and for Catherine to join her there. By April, Mary was better, and Catherine returned to court, leaving her precious princess in the care of her governess, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. At the end of May 1531, Mary joined the court at Windsor. Henry was still trying to make Catherine withdraw her appeal to Rome, but stubborn Catherine still claimed, "I am his true wife." In a fit of rage, Henry moved the court early on the 31st of May to Woodstock. Catherine, Mary and their attendants were deserted in the royal apartments. Henry had left without a goodbye, and the royal couple would never see each other again. Catherine remained at Windsor until early August 1531, and she saw Mary off to Richmond while she relocated to East Hampstead. Princess Mary made a visit to her mother, who was in Enfield, in January 1532. Neither mother nor daughter realised that once they went their separate ways, that they would never see each other again. King Henry VIII deliberately kept them apart, as he feared that together they might engage with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was a relative of both Mary and Catherine. He was scared that they might seek his help. He also thought that by keeping mother and daughter apart, it was a good way of punishing Catherine for not being compliant in the divorce. On the 25th of January 1533, while still technically married to Mary's mother, Catherine, King Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn in secret. Mary and Anne did not get along. Anne disliked Mary as much as she disliked Mary's mother, Catherine, who would be known as one of Anne's greatest rivals. Henry didn't dare praise Mary in case he sparked Anne's ferocious temper, and Henry would keep his visits to Mary as brief as possible. In May 1533, Mary was informed by the Privy Council of Archbishop Cranmer's decision to annul the marriage of Mary's parents, and that Anne Boleyn was now the new Queen of England. Mary would not accept anyone else as queen except her mother, which only worsened Anne's hatred of her stepdaughter. This would then cause a rift between father and daughter. Anne tried to bribe Mary by offering her an invitation to court and promising reconciliation with her father, the king, if she acknowledged her as queen. Mary responded saying that she only knew of one Queen of England, and that would be her mother. But if Madame Boleyn would talk to her father, the king, on her behalf for a reconciliation, then she would be much obliged. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn welcomed their first child on the 7th of September 1533, a daughter named Elizabeth, who was born at Greenwich Palace. The birth of Elizabeth changed Mary's position. Mary's household was to change, and she was declared illegitimate and was to no longer be referred to as the Princess Mary. From now on, she was to be referred to as the Lady Mary. The daughter who had once been given the privileges of a Princess of Wales was now degraded to an illegitimate daughter of the king. Mary's governess, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, offered to serve Mary at her own expense, but her offer was rejected by the king, who had already had a replacement in mind. The new Princess Elizabeth was christened on the 10th of September 1533, and Mary, who was as stubborn as her mother, was still using the title princess. Henry pressed his elder daughter to stop using the title of princess and to use the title of the Lady Mary, the King's daughter. Mary refused to accept the change in status, and she blamed Anne Boleyn rather than her father. However, Mary did say that she would accept Elizabeth as her sister, but as an illegitimate sister, the same way that she acknowledged Henry Fitzroy as her brother, but illegitimate. Mary would never acknowledge Elizabeth as a princess, because in her mind, the only princess around here was her. Both her father, King Henry VIII, and her stepmother Anne Boleyn insisted that Mary referred to herself as the Lady Mary, the King's daughter, much to Mary's displeasure. It's September 1533. Mary's half-sister, the Princess Elizabeth, was born on the 7th and christened on the 10th. By the December, Mary was forced, pretty much against her will, to join her younger sister's household at Hatfield. Mary's household was disbanded. She was stripped of the title of princess and was now to act as maid of honour for her half-sister as the Lady Mary. The Lady Mary had a close relationship with her governess Margaret, Countess of Salisbury. The Lady Salisbury got dismissed despite offering her services and was replaced by two of Anne Boleyn's relatives, Lady Anne Shelton and Lady Anne Clear, who had been sent by Anne to spy on her stepdaughter and make her life miserable. Anne hated the Lady Mary as she saw her for competition for her own daughter, the Princess Elizabeth. It was noted that in the February of 1534, Anne Boleyn had written to the Lady Shelton to ensure that Mary no longer used the title of princess, telling Shelton to slap her face as the cursed bastard that she was, if she persisted. The Lady Shelton was scared in case Mary fell ill, and she got the blame. And despite Anne's wishes, Anne Shelton befriended the Lady Mary. 1535 was a scary year for the Lady Mary, as Anne, who had had a miscarriage since the birth of Elizabeth, was pressing her husband, King Henry VIII, to execute his ex-wife and daughter. Anne told Henry that she had a dream that it would be impossible to conceive a child while Catherine and Mary lived. The reality was that Anne was actually safe all the time that Catherine was alive, because he wasn't going to get rid of her, seeing all the trouble that was caused to marry her in the first place. Plus, that would prove that he was wrong, and the king is not wrong. Henry was also starting to get frustrated with his strong-headed wife. Pun not intended. He failed to rise to Anne's bait, but that didn't stop her from pressing for their execution, which she did again in the November, as Anne was pregnant again. Anne was scared for herself, Elizabeth, and her unborn child. But Henry would not succumb to Anne's demands. During 1535, Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, was terribly ill, and her father and her stepmother had forbidden her from seeing her mother. On the 1st of December, it looked like Catherine might recover, so Anne Boleyn pushed Henry again to execute both Mary and Catherine. However, Henry had received Catherine's medical records and knew that Catherine did not have long, so he didn't act. And he was right. Mary's mother died 6 days later on the 7th of January 1536, at the age of 50, at Kimbolton Castle. In her will, Catherine left Mary the collar of gold which I brought out of Spain, and her furs. But Henry never passed on Catherine's belongings to his daughter. Anne, who was happy with the passing of her rival, offered an olive branch to her stepdaughter, inviting Mary back to court, stating she didn't have to carry Anne's train, and she would always walk by her side, on the condition that she submitted to her father's laws and recognised their marriage. Mary refused, and to add insult to injury, in the April, Mary stated that she believed the musician Mark Smeaton was Elizabeth's real father.
Uptight mama's daughter say what?
I feel like this is interesting because Mark Smeaton was actually one of the men that got executed with Anne's brother George Boleyn, because he was one of the men that was believed she had committed adultery with. So even before her downfall, there's this whole little thing going on between Anne and Mark Smeaton. Mary's stepmother was arrested on the 6th of May 1536, and Anne was accused at her trial of having poisoned the Dowager Queen Catherine and attempting to poison the Lady Mary. The night before her execution, Anne Boleyn thought that her fate was God's judgment for treating the Lady Mary so badly. Anne was beheaded the next day at the Tower of London. The death of Anne meant that Henry was now able to remarry, as both of his disputed wives were dead.
Where'd it tick? That means I'm single again! Oh, behave!
The news of Anne Boleyn's death revived Mary's spirits, as she now hoped that she may be able to reconcile with her father, with the help of her new stepmother-to-be, Jane Seymour. Although, to be fair, Mary, Anne did offer to help, although equally, she did try and have you executed.
Not a great plan.
So swings and roundabouts, I guess. Henry married his third wife and Mary's second stepmother on the 30th of May 1536, 11 days after Anne's execution. The Lady Mary offered her submission to her father on the 13th of June, and with the help of Jane Seymour, father and daughter were reconciled. But as Mary and Henry's relationship mended, Henry and Elizabeth's fractured, and Elizabeth was stripped of her title of princess and became a lady like her sister Mary. Henry was glad that his daughter had finally seen the light, but was irritated that it had taken her that long. He sent Sir Thomas Wriothesley to obtain a full declaration of Mary's faults in writing, and to ask her what ladies she would like in her household when she returns to her place in society. Mary was so grateful that she wrote a long letter to Thomas Cromwell, acknowledging her faults and thanking him for his kindness. Also, don't forget that Cromwell helped with the downfall of Anne Boleyn. When Henry read it, he was so happy he became the loving father he once was. Queen Jane was delighted, as she had been working on smoothing tensions for months. Also, it was rather lonely for Jane. Very few of her ladies could associate on virtually equal terms. Jane was from a minor gentry family and had steadily climbed the social ladder, and she had separated herself from those she had been friendly with to emphasise her rank. But now she was rather isolated. As the king's daughter, Mary was of high enough rank that she could provide companionship for the Queen. On the 6th of July, Henry and Jane visited Mary at her house in Hackney. It was the first time that Henry had spoken of his daughter affectionately in 6 years. He was kind and gentle with her, and 2 days later it was announced that Mary would rank as second lady at court after Queen Jane. Jane had not concerned herself with Anne Boleyn's child, Elizabeth. Mary had always been fond of her little sister, despite who her mother was, and she had started to take an interest in her sister's well-being, and visited her at Hatfield on the 21st of July. Mary wrote to their father saying that Elizabeth was in good health, and in time he would have a good cause to be proud of his youngest daughter. Mary had hopes this may help mend Henry and Elizabeth's relationship, like Jane had helped fix her own. That Christmas, Henry thought Jane was pregnant. Mary fainted when she witnessed her father patting Jane's belly, and both Henry and Jane had to assist getting Mary off the floor. Thanks to Mary's intervention in the relationship between Elizabeth and Henry, Elizabeth was also at court over Christmas, and was the first time that the family had been together. Henry and Jane sat at the table together, and Mary sat opposite Jane. Elizabeth wasn't old enough to join the adults, but Henry was seen playing with his youngest daughter during the festivities. Jane Seymour gave birth to her son Edward on the 12th of October 1537. Both Mary and Elizabeth had a role to play at their half-brother's christening. Mary was assigned as one of his godparents, and Elizabeth carried by Lord Beauchamp, Edward Seymour, and in her hands was the chrism. When the baptism was finished and Edward was named heir, Edward was conveyed back to the Queen's apartments, followed by his two sisters. This time, Elizabeth was walking holding hands with Mary. Jane Seymour would die from childbirth complications on the 24th of October 1537. After the Queen's death, Mary returned to Hunsdon with her sister Elizabeth, where she looked after her. Easter 1538, Mary brings the 4.5-year-old Elizabeth to court, and under Mary's tutelage, she was rigidly schooled in good behaviour and taught at an early age to wield a needle. Elizabeth became such an expert needlewoman that she completed a shirt of Cambridge and gave it as a New Year's Eve present for her brother Edward in 1539, but she was now accepted by her father once again. During her father's widowhood, Henry VIII tried and failed many times to arrange a marriage with Christina, Duchess of Milan. Milan would have made a nice addition to Henry's kingdom. As Christina said no, Henry tried to arrange marriages to Italian nobles for Elizabeth and Mary Fitzroy, Henry's former daughter-in-law. Henry also offered the Lady Mary as a bride to Dom Louis of Portugal, but nothing came out of any of these matches. December 1539, Henry VIII proposed a marriage between the Lady Mary and Duke Philip of Bavaria, who, much to Mary's dislike, was a Protestant. Henry, however, continued to press with the match, despite his daughter's disapproval, and invited Philip to London. According to historian Alison Weir, Mary declared that she would rather remain unmarried than enter such an alliance. But when Philip arrived in London, Mary had to greet him out of etiquette. From what I can gather, the two got on very well, despite the religious differences, and Philip told Henry that he wished to continue with the marriage. Mary then fell ill again. Whether this was real or fake, I don't know, but she basically hid from court so she didn't have to see Philip. And she was away for so long that she missed her father's wedding on the 6th of January 1540. On the 6th of January 1540, Henry VIII married his fourth wife, the Protestant Princess Anne of Cleves. The Lady Mary, a staunch Catholic, was horrified to learn that her father had married a Lutheran heretic. And yet, ironically, Mary and her new stepmother Anne of Cleves would become good friends, and Mary would convert the Lutheran heretic to Catholicism. Philip, Duke of Bavaria, hung around in England for most of January, just hoping that Mary would have recovered from her illness. However, now that Henry was married to Anne of Cleves and he decided he didn't like his new wife, Henry was now no longer interested in an alliance with a German. Philip, Duke of Bavaria, left England on the 27th of January, and the Lady Mary had miraculously recovered from her illness.
Right.
Henry was not a fan of his fourth wife and was desperate for an annulment so he could get married to his wife's lady-in-waiting, who he had had his eye on. Henry didn't have to wait long, and the couple divorced on the 12th of July 1540.
Will it tick? That means I'm single again!
Henry then married for a fifth time on the 28th of July 1540 to Catherine Howard, a woman who was younger than his eldest daughter, the Lady Mary. Mary was not the greatest fan of her new stepmother, but Queen Catherine was keen to make a good impression, and so, on the 3rd of January 1541, she invited her husband's ex-wife Anne of Cleves and the Lady Mary to Hampton Court Palace. Relations between Mary and Catherine were still not great, but Anne of Cleves got on with everyone, so she was able to smooth things over. Henry then had Mary's former governess and godmother, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, executed on the 27th of May 1541 because he had issue with Margaret's son Reginald, and she was executed on the pretext that she was involved with a Catholic plot, which is highly unlikely but still possible. Her execution was an absolute mess. Like, whoever organised this execution should be ashamed of themselves. Her executioner was inexperienced, and her neck and shoulders were hacked several times before the head came off. I can only imagine the anger and frustration that Mary would have felt towards her father at this point for executing someone who was so dear to her heart. And also, what made this worse is the fact that Margaret Pole was a pensioner.
What?
The Lady Mary then found herself involved in a marriage proposal between herself and the Duke of Orleans, but the ever-shaky relations of England and France deteriorated, and nothing happened. Catherine Howard, Mary's fourth stepmother, was executed for adultery on the 13th of February 1542.
Will it tick?
That Christmas, Henry invited Mary to attend the royal Christmas festivities. It was the custom for the Queen Consort to be the hostess. However, as Henry was
Single again!
and thus without a consort, Mary acted as hostess. Henry married for the sixth and final time on the 12th of July 1543 to Catherine Parr. Catherine, who had experience at being a stepmother, was alarmed to learn that all of her stepchildren lived away from court and rarely saw their father, and she was determined to provide a stable family environment for her stepchildren, and was the first stepmother to provide motherly affection since Jane Seymour. However, Mary was 27 and arguably didn't need a mother figure as much as her siblings Elizabeth IX and Edward V might have. By the August, Mary was a frequent visitor at court and was enjoying being in the company of her parents. Mary and Catherine Parr would soon become friends and respected Mary as the princess that she is, despite her father thinking otherwise. Catherine, who was 31, was of a similar age to her stepdaughter, but old enough so the dynamic didn't feel too weird, like it did with Catherine Howard. And the two shared similar interests. With the help of Catherine Parr, the ladies Mary and Elizabeth were put back in the line of succession when the new Act of Succession was passed on the 7th of February 1544. It stated that any children Henry and Catherine had, or children with another queen, would go after Edward, and if there was no other issue, then it would go to the Lady Mary, and then the Lady Elizabeth. On the 17th of February 1544, the Duke of Najera, a duke, visited the English court. Mary shined very brightly during this visit, as she could speak Spanish, so she could help Queen Catherine converse with the Duke. Later in the September, Mary received a letter from Catherine, who, don't forget, was a published author, praising her for her translation of Erasmus's paraphrases, and said Mary should publish her work. Mary declined the offer, and Catherine responded that she did not see why you should reject the praise which all deservedly would give you. Yet I leave all to your own prudence, and will approve of what seems best to you. Mary then said that she would contemplate publishing her work, if she could do it under a pseudonym. Catherine, as an early feminist, told Mary that it would do a real injury if you refused to let it go down to posterity under auspices of your own name. Mary finally caved, and the translation was printed and widely read, and received high praise from scholars across Europe. On the 27th of January 1547, King Henry VIII knew his time was nearly over. He saw his confessor and received Holy Communion. He then saw his daughter Mary and made her promise to be a king and a loving mother to Edward, whom he would leave as a little helpless child. Mary, who was in floods of tears, begged her father not to leave her an orphan so soon. Henry dismissed his crying child from the room. Mary's father, King Henry VIII, died on the 28th of January 1547 at Whitehall Palace. Upon her father's death, Mary inherited several estates in Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, and was given Hunsdon and Beaulieu. Her younger brother Edward became King Edward VI. Typically, a queen consort would be expected to mourn for a few years. However, Dowager Queen Catherine Parr got remarried within a few months to Thomas Seymour. The Lady Mary was, like many, thought this was scandalous, and she lost some of her respect for her stepmother. Thomas Seymour wrote Mary a letter asking her to use her influence to help gain favour with the council for approval of the marriage, and to help persuade Catherine to go public with the marriage. Mary was horrified at his impertinence and responded saying, "It standeth least with my poor honour to be a meddler in this matter, concerning whose wife her grace was of late. If she remembrance of the king's majesty will not suffer her to grant your suit, I am nothing able to persuade her to forget the loss of him who is yet very ripe in mine own remembrance." But Mary's response didn't matter, because by the time Thomas received it, Catherine had already come round to the idea of announcing the marriage publicly. Catherine, however, did grieve for the loss of Mary's friendship. Mary then thought of her little sister Elizabeth, and voiced her concern of Elizabeth associating herself with their stepmother, and wanted to protect her innocence. Mary wrote to Elizabeth warning her of Catherine's wickedness and begged her to think of her own reputation. But Elizabeth was fond of Catherine, and she wrote a response to Mary acknowledging their shared grief, and in seeing the scarcely cold body of the king our father, so shamefully dishonoured by the queen our stepmother. Elizabeth then backtracked, saying, "We should make the best of what we cannot remedy." Despite Mary's warning, Elizabeth would join the household of Catherine and Thomas Seymour. And Mary's warning turned out to be right, as Thomas Seymour would behave horrendously towards his ward and would potentially destroy Elizabeth's innocence. Catherine would eventually conceive Thomas's baby, and in the August of 1548, the baby was nearly due. It was at this time that Catherine Parr reconciled with the Lady Mary, as Mary was excited about the birth of the baby, and the two women started corresponding again. Catherine gave birth to a daughter on the 30th of August 1548 at Sudeley Castle. The girl was named Mary after Catherine's stepdaughter, the Lady Mary. The labour was difficult, and Catherine Parr died days later on the 7th of September. Both Mary and Elizabeth grieved for their stepmother. Mary often spoke of the great love and affection that did bear onto her grace, and she never forgot what her father owed to Catherine. Without Catherine there to mediate the relationships of her children, the once close bond between sisters would continue to fracture after Catherine's death. During Edward's reign, the country was going through a second Protestant Reformation, which was tough for the Catholic Mary, who was continuing her Catholic practices anyway. In her eyes, Edward was her little brother, and she was his legal heir, so what was he going to do about it? As Edward couldn't do anything to his sister, he imprisoned her priests instead. In the spring of 1550, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V sent ambassadors to ask Edward for a special license to allow Mary to practice Mass. But Edward said no. Mary asked for Charles's help again, and this time he sent ships to get her from Essex. But Mary was unable to escape, because A, she hesitated, and B, English ships cut off her route. Edward and Mary reunited at Christmas, but their feuding had not ceased. Mary went out of her way to not hide her Catholic practices. She was having Mass 4 times a day. It is said that Edward embarrassed Mary and reduced both her and himself to tears in front of the court, by publicly reproving her for ignoring his laws regarding worship. Mary repeatedly refused Edward's demands that she abandon Catholicism, and Edward persistently refused to drop his demands. The two would make up before the holiday was over, but a month later Edward sent Mary a letter. "You're breaking the law. Correct your behaviour. I have natural affection for you. Do not seek to diminish it." Early July 1553, King Edward VI was extremely ill, and the manipulative Duke of Northumberland changed the Act of Succession, so Mary was bumped off as the heir presumptive. In the new Act of Succession, Mary's cousin, Lady Jane Grey, was next in line, who, conveniently, was married to Northumberland's son, Guilford Dudley. The Duke of Northumberland knew that Mary would be a problem for Jane to assume the throne efficiently. So, he summoned Mary to court on the pretense of seeing her dying brother, but Mary is tipped off about Northumberland's trap and flees to her estates in Norfolk. King Edward VI dies on the 6th of July 1553, and Mary's cousin assumes the throne instead of her. On the 10th of July 1553, Mary sends a letter to Jane's Privy Council. She gives them the ultimatum of abandon Jane or start a civil war. Submitting to Mary would also mean loss of titles for most of the members of the Privy Council. The Privy Council then sent a response and got Jane to sign the letter as Jane the Queen, a letter that would later be used as evidence of Jane's treason.
Not a great plan.
However, Mary was her father's daughter. The Lady Mary was more popular than Jane and was a lawful claimant to the throne. After sending a letter to Mary that would ultimately anger her with Jane's signature, the council realised that Mary might have a bigger army than they thought. They also allowed their best politician and military man, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, to leave London and raise a small army to capture Mary at Framlingham Castle. Northumberland underestimated Mary's support. Ultimately, Jane was stripped of her title as queen and gave up the crown readily for her cousin Mary. Jane had never wanted to be queen in the first place. Jane was arrested and placed in the Tower of London. Mary was declared Queen of England on the 19th of July 1553. The council, who were in support of Jane, quickly swung to Mary, and Londoners rejoiced at hearing that Mary was their new queen. Mary issued a proclamation that she would not compel any of her subjects to follow Catholicism. By the end of September 1553, she had gone back on this. Mary's sister Elizabeth reached London on the 29th of July 1553, and upon seeing that Mary had not yet arrived, she rode out to meet her sister, who she met on the 31st, at the city gates accompanied by a full royal train. Elizabeth knelt at her sister's feet, swearing her allegiance. Mary smiled and raised her sister from her knees, and the two embraced. As the procession continued on its way towards London, the Lady Elizabeth was in the place of honour, immediately behind her sister. Elizabeth knew that she was more popular than her sister, and so she had to make sure not to overshine her. Queen Mary I entered the Tower of London on the 3rd of August, and upon her arrival, she released all of the Catholics that had been imprisoned by her father. Many called for the death of Jane and Guilford, but Mary didn't want any bloodshed. Francis pleaded that the Grey family had been Northumberland's victims. He was charged with high treason. Henry Grey was set free, and in the September, Mary declared that her sister was still illegitimate, and that she wanted to restore the old ways of worship, which included Bibles only in Latin and no married priests. However, times had changed, and Mary would find it difficult to get her subjects to conform. Mary thought that by forcing people to practice Catholicism, that she was helping them, and she truly did believe that all non-Catholics were going to hell. Mary started with her court, and everyone at her court was supposed to go to maths. Did I say maths or maths? I'm going to leave that in, and I think you can decide in the comment section below if I said maths or maths. Mary started with her court, and everyone at her court was supposed to go to mass, including the Protestant Lady Elizabeth. Mary was crowned Queen Mary I on the 1st of October 1553 at Westminster Abbey, and became the first crowned Queen of England. Mary's coronation was on the 1st of October 1553 at Westminster Abbey. Mary's former stepmother and friend, Anne of Cleves, took place of honour along with her sister Elizabeth at the lavish coronation. The two ladies shared an open chariot, and they were given new dresses made from a rich silver material. They walked directly behind the new queen in the procession to Westminster Abbey. At her ceremony, Mary was given 2 sceptres and crowned both king and queen, as England had never coronated a queen before. Not like this anyway. So those running the ceremony didn't really have any idea on what they were doing, as a queen was, and kinda still is, of a lower rank to a king. This is why Queens Anne, Victoria and Elizabeth II never made their husbands king consort, as they would have technically outranked them. Mary stated that her coronation ring was a wedding ring to her country, and that she loves her country like her mother loved her children. Mary was very good at PR. That is, until she marries Philip. As a staunch Catholic, Mary was horrified at her father's and brother's Reformation policies. And now that she was queen, she had the power to reverse all of Edward's Protestant policies and made the Pope the head of England's state, not the monarch.
Not a great plan.
This upset and confused a lot of people, as nobody knew where they stood. As her Catholic reversal continued, Mary went from merely reversing policies to persecuting Protestants. Lady Jane Grey, who was currently in the Tower of London, and who had many people calling for her death, was horrified by what Mary had done, as Jane was a Protestant and wrote a letter to the Queen slandering her and her religion. What she wrote couldn't have been nice because, according to Jane,
Catholic souls were the sinking kennels of Satan.
Right.
Thankfully, Mary ignored her remarks. I would not suggest insulting the woman who could literally sign your death warrant, especially when Jane and Guilford would be tried and convicted of high treason the next month on the 14th of November 1553. Jane pleaded guilty, but Mary still wasn't convinced of Jane's guilt. After all, she was just a pawn of the manipulative men around her. Mary's conscience would not allow her to put a teenage cousin to death and suspended her death sentence. As I said earlier, Mary was good at PR. By sparing Jane, Mary is able to spin this whole narrative of the evil Northumberland manipulating her brother Edward into writing Mary out of the succession. It was Northumberland's wishes, not Edward's. Edward would never have written her out of the succession if he was in his right mind, because it was pretty obvious that Mary was his true heir. Jane even said after the trial that she, meaning Mary in this instance, is a merciful queen. In early 1554, word got out that Mary was planning on marrying, which is great because England needs an heir, but not so great because it's Mary's cousin Philip, who is also a Catholic, and the match was very unpopular with the public and the Privy Council. It is Mary's marriage that destroys her popularity with her subjects. A series of uprisings would ensue during January and February, which would be known as the Wyatt Rebellion, after its leader, Thomas Wyatt. There is a common misconception that this rebellion was in order to put Jane back on the throne instead of Mary, but this actually wasn't the case. Jane's father was involved in the rebellion, and thus that is how she's implicated, but the rebels actually intended to depose Mary in favour of her sister Elizabeth, who was a Protestant. Thomas Wyatt, the leader, travelled from Kent to London, and when he reached London, his feeble rebellion was defeated, and he was captured. Wyatt, Henry Grey, Lady Jane, and her husband Guilford were all executed as a result. The rebellion proved that the threat of Jane was real and that she was too dangerous to be kept alive, which led to Mary signing her death warrant. The rebellion made Mary view Jane as a figurehead for future Protestant revolts, despite them wanting Elizabeth as queen and not Jane, and yet somehow it would be Jane that would be executed. Rather cruelly, Mary deliberately had Henry Grey's execution after Jane's so he could watch what he had done to his daughter. Elizabeth, however, got off lightly. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London, despite protesting her innocence in the Wyatt revolt, and 2 months later she was downgraded to house arrest. Mary gave the Dudleys one last chance to spare their lives. If they converted to Catholicism, she would spare them. However, both Jane and Guilford refused, and so Mary signed Jane and Guilford's death warrant on the 7th of February 1554, and they were executed on the 12th of February. Jane took her prayer book with her to the scaffold and handed it over just before she knelt for her beheading. Jane had written some messages in her prayer book. One of them is a heartfelt message to her father. She writes, "The Lord comforts your grace, and that the word wherein all creatures can only be comforted. And thou it hath pleased God to take away 2 of your children. Yet think not that you have lost them, but trust that we, by leaving this mortal life, have won an immortal life. Your Grace's humble daughter, Jane Dudley." Jane signing her message as Jane Dudley instead of Jane the Queen adds more innocence. She wasn't trying to be a martyr. It just proves she didn't lust for the throne. Instead, she was just a young girl who was newly married and had her life cut short. Her father would follow on the 23rd, and Wyatt would be executed on the 11th of April. Mary was more like her father than she thought. Paranoid, she invited Jane's younger sisters, Catherine and Mary Grey, to court as maids of honours, so she could keep a close eye on them.
I'm watching you, Wazowski. Always watching.
Despite the opposition, Mary and Philip's marriage went ahead on the 25th of July 1554, and they were married at Winchester Cathedral. Mary knew her marriage wasn't popular, but she saw it as her duty to provide a Catholic heir. Philip was a son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was hoping to add England to his empire through Philip. However, Parliament did not want that to happen. Parliament agreed to the marriage after Charles V consented to leave Mary in full control of England and to keep the throne in English hands if the marriage is childless, which he did agree to. Mary's grandparents, Isabella and Ferdinand, had retained sovereignty of their respective realms during their marriage, but so far in England there was no precedence to follow, and the common law at the time stated that all lands and titles that belonged to a woman would belong to the man upon marriage, which was why Parliament insisted on the prenup before the marriage went ahead. The document for the marriage agreement stated that Philip would have the title of King of England, and documents would have both of their names on, and they would have joint authority, but only while Mary lived. England would not be obliged to support Charles in any war, and Philip could not act in foreign affairs without the consent of Mary. Philip was not happy, so, to make him happy, Charles abdicated from the throne of Naples so Philip could be King of Naples in his own right, and ultimately made him worthy of marrying a queen regnant. Philip also inherited the kingdom of Jerusalem, and thus Mary became Queen of Naples and Jerusalem upon her marriage to Philip. Philip and Mary communicated in a mixture of Spanish, French and Latin, as Philip couldn't speak English, and at their wedding, Mary was sat on the right in the king's seat, and Philip was sat on the left in the consort's seat. Mary loved her husband, but he didn't love her, and by August he was campaigning in Flanders and rarely came to England. Mary pined for him, but Philip was put off by her bad breath, although she did have a condition, so it wasn't technically her fault. Additionally, she also tried to tempt him back home by sending him his favourite meat pies. He ate the pies, but he didn't come back.
It's funny because it's true.
In the September, Mary thought that she might be pregnant. She stopped menstruating, gained weight, and felt nauseated in the mornings. Without the invention of a pregnancy test and her showing signs, there was no reason to doubt her beliefs. Parliament passed an act that made Philip regent in the event of Mary's death in childbirth. Pregnancy in the Tudor era was very much seen as the woman's thing, so she withdrew from public life and her doctors had to diagnose her from afar, based on what Mary could tell them about her quote-unquote pregnancy. 7 months later, in April 1555, Mary was preparing for her birth. Philip returned to England and persuaded Mary to release her sister Elizabeth from house arrest, which she did, and then she called her to court to witness the birth of her replacement as heir. You could ask the question, if Mary was so desperate to provide an heir that wasn't Elizabeth, why didn't she name Mary Queen of Scots as her heir? I mean, it's a good point, as both Marys were Catholic, unlike Elizabeth. But remember, Queen Mary Tudor was half Spanish through her mother, Catherine. Queen Mary of Scots had an alliance with France, Spain's enemy. It was better to have Elizabeth on the throne, who might convert to Catholicism, than a French sympathiser. Philip, who was also Spanish, had concerns about Mary Queen of Scots being second in line to the throne, so he suggested that Elizabeth should marry his cousin, and he was probably Mary's cousin as well, Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy, to secure a Catholic succession. Philip was convinced that Elizabeth was submissive and that she could be converted and would do whatever she was told if he found the right husband to manipulate her. But Gloriana refused. Mary continued to show signs of pregnancy, including the bump, until the July, when her stomach started to recede. Some historians believe that Mary had a phantom pregnancy because she was so desperate to conceive, while others believe she was most likely had a tumour or a cyst, as she clearly displayed an inflated stomach. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Mary had pre-signed documents weeks before she was due, announcing her baby boy. I mean, it is only a 50% chance it will be a boy. We're fortunate with hindsight to know what happens next, but for Mary, I could imagine her desperation, her anxiety, and humiliation as the realization sunk in that she wasn't actually pregnant. Because as we know, no baby came. By August, everyone had given up on Mary's pregnancy. Philip left England to command his armies back in Flanders, and Mary saw this false pregnancy as God's punishment for having tolerated heretics. With Philip gone, Mary was miserable, and now she was convinced that God was angry with her, and so starts the reign of Bloody Mary. She believed that the only way she could make right with God is to burn as many heretics as she could find.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
One such heretic was John Hooper, the Bishop of Gloucester. He had tied a bag of gunpowder around his neck in hopes of a quick end, but it failed to ignite, and he suffered in the flames for 45 minutes. About 800 Protestants fled England during Mary's reign to Germany and Geneva, and as the burnings increased, Mary's popularity declined. Elizabeth had been with her sister throughout the false pregnancy ordeal. Mary agreed that Elizabeth could return to Hatfield with the staff of her choice, which she did, but Elizabeth stayed at court with her sister until the 18th of October. History likes pitting these two as rivals, but I think this is an example of compassion and sisterly love, and also Elizabeth being tactful to return to favour. Mary had her father's longtime advisor, Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer, burnt at the stake. Cranmer was a Protestant and refused to convert to Catholicism, so he was burnt at the stake on the 21st of March 1556. Mary was now in need of a new archbishop, so she chose Reginald Pole, the estranged son of her former governess, Lady Margaret Pole, who took up the role pretty much straight after Cranmer's execution.
That was fast.
Philip returned to England from March to July in 1557 for more pies. No, not really. He actually needed English support in the war that Spain was fighting against France, but he had been banned from getting involved in foreign affairs, so he had to get Mary's consent. Mary was so desperate for Philip to stay that she agreed, hoping he would be happy, despite her counsellor's warning of ruining their trade relations with France. England had suffered financially under both of the reigns of Edward VI and King Henry VIII, and quite frankly, we just lacked the supplies and money. By January of 1558, we had lost the war with France, and Mary's biggest legacy after the nickname was that she lost Calais, the last English stronghold in France.
You blew it!
Losing Calais had made her very unpopular, especially with the English nobles who lived or had property in Calais. Calais had been in English hands since the conquest of King Edward III, a source of great sadness to the Queen. She was reported to have said at the time, "When I am dead and chested, you will find Calais written on my heart." After Philip's visit in 1557, Mary again thought that she was pregnant with a baby, due in March 1558. She decreed in her will that her husband would be the regent during the minority of their child, but yet again, no child would be born, and Mary's health was failing her, potentially from ovarian cancer or cysts. On the 6th of November 1558, Mary, realising that her time was near, reluctantly recognised Elizabeth as her successor. Mary would die on the 17th of November 1558 at the age of 42. She died at St. James's Palace. She died childless, sick, and deserted by Philip. The day before she died, England and France were at war, and the peace treaty had been brought to the chamber for her to sign, but she was too ill. When she died the next day, her minister went to her bedroom to try and find the document, but Mary's chief lady-in-waiting used the treaty to wrap Mary's corpse.
What?
When Mary died, she left Elizabeth a will, asking Elizabeth to become a Catholic, for the Spanish jewels to be returned to Philip, and for Mary to be buried next to her mother, Catherine of Aragon. All of which Elizabeth didn't do.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity, and the gumption.
To give Elizabeth her credit, she did, however, give Mary a Catholic send-off that was regal and fit for the first coronated Queen of England, as she didn't want to encourage disrespect for royalty. After all, it was now her turn. Mary was buried at Westminster Abbey on the 14th of December 1558, and Elizabeth didn't attend the funeral. Elizabeth was born on the 7th of September 1533 at Greenwich Palace to King Henry VIII and his second wife and queen, Queen Anne Boleyn. The Princess Elizabeth was the couple's first and only surviving child, although at this point Henry had two illegitimate children, the Lady Mary and Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset. Unlike when her sister was born, Elizabeth's arrival was a disappointment for both of her parents. The celebrations at court were muted, very cold and disagreeable, and there had been no thought of having the bonfires and rejoicings usual in such cases, according to the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis. Henry's enemies believed that the birth of a daughter was divine punishment for the king's controversial divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The birth of the Princess Elizabeth meant that the Princess Mary was now illegitimate and was now to be referred to as the Lady Mary. Elizabeth was christened 3 days later on the 10th. Elizabeth was Henry's heir, but she was not a welcomed one. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk helped carry the canopy of estate, and Elizabeth was wrapped in a mantle of purple velvet with a long train. Mary Howard carried a chrisom of pearl and stone to put on the child at baptism, and quickly conceived a deep and protective love for her child, as any mother would do, and to begin with, hated to let her out of her sight. By her throne under the canopy of estate lay her baby on a velvet cushion. Anne feared that Mary posed a threat to Elizabeth's position. Henry soothed Anne's fears by separating Mary from many of her servants and eventually disbanded her household. In the December, plague had hit London, so Henry sent Mary and Elizabeth to Hatfield House, where the country air was better for the baby and would become a favourite home for the young princess. Mary was to be a maid of honour for her half-sister, against her wishes. Anne often visited her daughter at Eltham or Hatfield, and Henry was also proud of his red-haired daughter and liked showing her off to visiting ambassadors. Anne was delighted in July 1535 as King Francis at last agreed to enter negotiations for the marriage of Elizabeth to his third son. However, to many, Mary was still seen as next in line, as not everyone recognised the new marriage, despite being declared illegitimate and Elizabeth named as heir. November 1535, Anne found out she was pregnant again. Anne had suffered miscarriages since Elizabeth, and she had suffered from depression during the first few months as she knew her future was riding on this baby, as Henry was becoming less tolerable of his strong-headed wife, and Henry's pursuit of Jane Seymour was
pretty obvious.
Anne repeatedly pressed Henry to execute Catherine and Lady Mary out of fear for herself, Elizabeth, and the unborn child, but Henry would not succumb to Anne's demands. Catherine of Aragon fell dangerously ill. The ironic thing is, despite Anne believing that Catherine was her downfall, Catherine was Anne's safety net. as long as Catherine was around, Anne was safe. Henry would not harm her, as it would prove he was wrong. Catherine of Aragon died on the 7th of January 1536, the same day that Elizabeth's mother, Anne, would miscarry her saviour, as she saw Jane Seymour sat on the king's knee. 2 days later, on the 9th, the king and queen held a court ball to celebrate the threat of war dying with Catherine. The royal couple wore yellow, the royal colour of mourning in Spain, out of a sign of respect, although it has been argued that this was actually a snub to Catherine, as it was a party and it involved dancing and everyone was enjoying life in bright colours rather than being sombre and wearing black, the English colour of mourning. The Princess Elizabeth was paraded around the room in the arms of her father, who took great pleasure in showing off his child. Anne Boleyn spent the early months of 1536 at Greenwich. She rarely saw the king now, and spent her days doing charity work, playing with her dogs, and ordering new clothes. Her accounts show that she kept Elizabeth dressed majestically. The month of May would be the downfall of Anne Boleyn, and feeling that something was amiss, Anne charged her chaplain, Matthew Parker, with the care of Elizabeth on the 26th of April 1536. Anne was right to do so, as she was executed on the 19th of May 1536, along with her uncle George on the 17th. Elizabeth's position and safety at court was never certain after Anne's execution. She was demoted from princess to lady, and she wasn't protected, as she was not the heir to the throne, like her brother Edward, nor did she have a powerful family member to protect her, like her half-sister Mary. Elizabeth had to learn to be silent and invisible from a young age, if she planned on surviving. On the next day, the 20th of May, Henry wore white, the royal colour of mourning in France, as this is where Anne pretty much grew up. This to me is also evidence that when they wore yellow for Catherine, it wasn't actually a snub. Henry gave orders for Elizabeth to be taken from Greenwich to Hatfield in the care of Lady Margaret Bryan and kept out of his sight. Elizabeth, like her sister Mary, was deemed illegitimate and was now to use the title the Lady Elizabeth, like her sister, and was not to refer to herself as a princess. Elizabeth would remain a lady until she became queen in 1558. Elizabeth gained her first stepmother on the 30th of May 1536 when her father married Jane Seymour. We don't know when Elizabeth realised what was going on, however, the absence of her mother and the appearance of Jane would certainly have been noticeable. It is noted that the once precocious princess asked Sir John Shelton, who was in charge of her household, "How hath it, yesterday, Lady Princess, and today but Lady Elizabeth?" This shows that she knew something was wrong, and the 3-year-old Elizabeth was already demonstrating her infamous intellect. As mentioned in the last video, Elizabeth didn't have a powerful family to look after her like Mary did. Her father wanted nothing to do with her, and neither did Jane. Initially, she didn't want to be associated with the child of a traitor. So, Mary's maternal side took over. She was the one that looked after her little sister and took an interest in her education. After all, Mary's beef wasn't with Elizabeth, it was with her dead mother, Anne Boleyn. On the 21st of July 1536, Mary visited Elizabeth at Hatfield, and she wrote to their father to say Elizabeth was in good health, and in time, he would have good cause to be proud of his youngest daughter. It was thanks to Mary's intervention that at Christmas, Elizabeth was welcomed to court, and Henry showed affection to his youngest for the first time since May. The 12th of October 1537 saw the birth of Elizabeth's brother Edward, and both sisters would take part in the prince's christening. Mary was a godparent, while Elizabeth was carried by her brother's maternal uncle in the procession. She carried the chrism, and once Edward was baptised and named heir, Elizabeth and Mary walked back to the Queen's apartments hand in hand. Their sisterly love at the beginning is so sweet, and it's just so sad when you know how quickly their relation starts to get strained. Elizabeth lost her stepmother on the 24th of October 1537. Her father was heartbroken. After Jane's death, Elizabeth went to Huntston, where she was looked after by Mary, since her governess had been transferred to Prince Edward's household. Elizabeth was brought to court by her sister for the Easter celebrations in 1538. She was 4.5, and even Chapuis described her as being certainly very pretty. Elizabeth became an expert needlewoman and was able to complete a shirt for her brother Edward as a New Year's gift in 1539, and despite her intellect and her achievements, even at a young age, she still failed to get her father's approval. But baby steps were being made, as Henry was treating her as his daughter, although he wasn't exactly Father of the Year. Elizabeth got a new stepmother on the 6th of January 1540, when her father married Anne of Cleves, and this marriage would be even shorter than the last one. However, Anne would stay in contact with Elizabeth after the divorce. Elizabeth, who was arguably desperate for a mother figure, wrote to Anne shortly after the wedding, trying to make a good impression. She wanted to come to court and meet her new stepmother. She wrote, "Permit me to show by this billet." She wrote in this at the first of her letters to survive, "the zeal which I devote my respect to you as queen, and my entire obedience to you as my mother. I am too young and feeble to have power to do more than felicitate you with all my heart in this commencement of your marriage. I hope that your majesty will have as much goodwill for me as I have zeal for your service." Anne was touched and impressed by the now 6-year-old Elizabeth, and asked Henry if Elizabeth could come to court, but he said no. He took the letter and gave it to Cromwell, and then ordered him to write a reply. "Tell her," he said brutally, "that she had a mother so different from this woman that she ought not to wish to see her." Henry then divorced Anne of Cleves on the 12th of July 1540.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
As mentioned earlier, Anne wanted to stay in touch with Henry's children. Her and Mary were of a similar age, and the two were friends, while Elizabeth was a bright girl who was in need of a mother. Unlike her brother Edward, Elizabeth was not fussed over by governesses and nurses. Anne had no plans to remarry and have children, and Elizabeth could be her child. So Anne asked Henry if she could invite Elizabeth to visit her on occasions, saying that to have had her for her daughter would have been greater happiness to her than being queen. Thanks to Anne's cooperation in annulling the marriage, Henry agreed, and it may be assumed that the Lady Elizabeth would frequent her former stepmother at Richmond Palace. Henry VIII married his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, at Oatlands Palace in Surrey on the 28th of July 1540, and that very same day he also had his former right-hand man Thomas Cromwell executed. This marriage was a glimmer of hope for the Lady Elizabeth, as her new stepmother was a relative. Catherine was first cousins with her mother Anne Boleyn. Because Catherine Howard was related to Elizabeth, the little princess was given the place of honour at the royal wedding banquet. It was thought that Catherine reminded Henry of Anne Boleyn, but the dismissive version he had hoped for, not the argumentative and ambitious version that he got. Catherine Howard was then executed on the 13th of February 1542, with Elizabeth's auntie, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Elizabeth would get her 4th and final stepmother on the 12th of July 1543, when Catherine Parr married her father in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court Palace. Catherine, who was on her 3rd marriage, was a seasoned wife and stepmother, and it concerned her greatly that all 3 of her stepchildren lived separately away from court and rarely saw their father. In August of 1543, she wrote to all 3 of them and asked if they would come and visit her and their father at court. The Lady Elizabeth responded promptly and expressed in very eloquent terms her appreciation of Catherine's kindness, which she was sure she did not deserve. She promised that she would conduct herself that Catherine would never have cause for complaint, and that she would be diligent in showing obedience and respect. I await with much impatience the orders of the king, my father, for the accomplishment of the happiness for which I sigh, and I remain with much submission. Your Majesty's very dear Elizabeth. It wasn't long before both Elizabeth and her sister Mary arrived at court. Henry had never felt comfortable in Elizabeth's company, but with Catherine Parr's influence he softened towards his daughter, and it seemed for Elizabeth that she had finally got the mother that she had been longing for. Elizabeth was nearly 10, and she was already showing signs of inheriting her mother's courage, love of flattery, and her flirty disposition, something that we would see in her reign as queen. It was commented about Elizabeth's intelligence, as we have noted earlier, but also her sharp wit that rivalled any adult. However, Elizabeth was not as volatile as her mother had been. Her insecure childhood had taught her the value of discretion and deception, something that her mother had failed to learn. Also, like her mother, Elizabeth spoke several languages, which impressed the new queen, who decided to supervise Elizabeth's education, seeing the potential in the young lady. On the 7th of February 1544, Elizabeth's father passed a new Act of Succession. It was clear that he was stuck with the 3 children that he had, so this new Act of Succession brought Mary and Elizabeth back in the line of succession, if he or Edward failed to produce children. However, he was still adamant that they were both illegitimate. However, it would not be long before father and daughter's relationship declined again. We don't know what the argument was about, but Elizabeth was banished from court and asked Catherine Parr to step in and talk to her father on her behalf. She had not dared write to her father. She confessed and begged her stepmother to send a letter on her behalf, praying ever for his sweet benediction, and beseeching God to send him victory over his enemies, so that your highness and I may soon as possible rejoice in his happy return. Henry had gone off to France on campaign, and absence from his wife had made him all the fonder, and when Catherine wrote again, begging him to forgive Elizabeth for her unknown offence and receive the child again at court, he relented and gave his permission for her to go to Greenwich to keep Catherine company. In the new year of 1545, the Lady Elizabeth sent her stepmother her translation of Margaret of Nevers' book, Le Mémoire de l'M. Pécheresse. I have absolutely butchered that, but we're rolling with it. It was written in a beautiful fine italic script, and she had obviously taken a lot of care over it. Catherine was already a published author, and it's fair to say that maybe this is what inspired Elizabeth to do so. Elizabeth begged Catherine not to show anyone else, as it is all imperfect and incorrect. Catherine was deeply moved that Elizabeth had gone to such trouble, and on the first page Elizabeth had dedicated the book to Catherine. To the most noble and virtuous Queen Catherine, Elizabeth, her humble daughter, wisheth perpetual felicity and everlasting joy. King Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547. He was 55. The new king, Elizabeth's little brother Edward, was at Hertford Castle. Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, travelled to Enfield on the 30th of January, where they met Elizabeth. Brother and sister were informed of their father's passing. The 2 children of 9 and 13 wept inconsolably. Edward was proclaimed King Edward VI the next day. Their stepmother Catherine Parr, on the other hand, although sad, had other ideas about the king's passing. Catherine had been courting Thomas Seymour prior to marrying the king, and so she was now free to pursue that again if she so wished. Henry's funeral was on the 16th of February, and he was laid to rest with Edward's mother Jane Seymour at Windsor Castle in St. George's Chapel. In the same month, Thomas Seymour, another of Edward VI's uncles, was looking for a marriage that would increase his power at court. he was rather jealous that his brother Edward Seymour had been made Lord Protector. He considered Catherine Parr, the king's widow and former beau, but she had relatively little power now. The king's oldest sister Mary was a Catholic, so no. And then there was the king's other sister, the Lady Elizabeth. She was 13, nearly childbearing age, and had inherited her mother's flirtatious charm and ability to captivate men. Thomas Seymour, Lord Sudeley, decided to pursue Elizabeth, declaring his affection in flattering letters, and begged her to know whether I am to be the most happy or the most miserable of men. Although she was 13, Elizabeth knew exactly what he was after. But Elizabeth was not able to choose her marriage partners. She would have to get the Privy Council's permission, and it was unlikely they would give it to her in case her brother wanted to use her for a political alliance. Consequently, she turned down Seymour's proposal, saying, "Neither my age nor my inclination allows me to think of marriage," and that she needed at least 2 years to get over the loss of her father before contemplating it. She went on, "Permit me, my Lord Admiral, to tell you frankly that, though I decline the happiness of becoming your wife, I shall never cease to interest myself in all that can crown your merits with glory, and shall ever feel the greatest pleasure in being your servant and good friend." With that, Thomas went back to the drawing board. His options now consisted of the Catholic Lady Mary, or the Dowager Queen and former beau, Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour wed in secret in April, although they did do a terrible job at keeping it a secret.
You guys should date. And then not tell me about it.
I think she knows.
Like the actual worst. People pretty much found out as soon as they got married. The Lady Mary found out about the wedding and was horrified as Catherine was supposed to be in mourning for her father, and she saw her as a disgrace. Mary was worried about Elizabeth putting herself morally at risk by keeping in contact with Catherine, and wanting to protect her sister's innocence, she wrote to Elizabeth, warning her against contacting Catherine and begged her to think of her own reputation. But Elizabeth, despite rejecting the Lord Admiral, did have a crush on him. She just wasn't prepared to be used, and she was fond of her stepmother. She ignored Mary's warning and said that she shared Mary's grief for their father, and in seeing scarcely cold body of the king our father so shamefully dishonoured by the queen our stepmother. However, in her opinion, the best course to take was one of dissimulation, and making the best of what we cannot remedy. In November 1547, Catherine published her second book, Lamentations of a Sinner. At this time, Elizabeth had been at her brother's court, but Edward was a staunch Protestant, and he introduced a rigid ceremonial requirement that meant Elizabeth had to drop on one knee 5 times in front of her brother before seating herself far away from his side. Edward viewed Elizabeth as illegitimate, so that's why she wasn't able to sit with her brother. Catherine was probably aware of Elizabeth's situation and invited her to come live with her in 1548. Catherine discovered that she was pregnant in the March, and while she was at daily prayers, her husband Thomas would go canoodling with their ward Elizabeth. Catherine was too preoccupied being pregnant that she didn't notice, or deliberately turned a blind eye, to her husband openly engaging with Elizabeth in front of household staff. The trio stayed at Seymour Place in London in the spring. Thomas would go to Elizabeth's bedroom every morning wearing only his nightgown and slippers, and burst in, regardless of whether or not she was in bed. Her lady-in-waiting, Mrs. Catherine Ashley, was present and was immediately suspicious, thinking it an unseemly sight to see a man so little dressed in a maiden's chamber. Cat Ashley, sometimes Astley, was the only person in that household trying to protect Elizabeth. What really disturbed Mrs. Ashley, according to her later deposition to the Privy Council, was that he only stayed if Elizabeth was in bed. If he found her up and dressed, he would just look in at the gallery door, then leave. Despite Kat's best efforts, Thomas would continue his morning break-ins, and if Elizabeth was in bed, he would climb in and tickle her. On one occasion, he tried to kiss her, but Kat swooped in and sent him out. For the time being, Elizabeth seemed to be enjoying this attention. As we mentioned, she seemed to have a crush on him, and she didn't rebuff him. However, there are also accounts of Elizabeth rising early to try and avoid Thomas getting in her bed, as he would not act if she was already dressed. So at some point Elizabeth potentially stopped enjoying the attention, or her love of it wasn't always consistent. And what did Catherine do? Nothing. She raised no protest when she heard that the Admiral would pull apart Elizabeth's bed curtains and make as though he would come at her, causing her to shrink back giggling into the bed to avoid being tickled. The Admiral said it was harmless, and the Queen believed him. Catherine even accompanied her husband on some early morning visits to Elizabeth's room. While at Hamworth, the Seymour couple chased Elizabeth through the gardens. When Thomas caught her, they wrestled together. Thomas got some shears and cut Elizabeth's black gown into strips, while Catherine held her stepdaughter still, all the while laughing. Elizabeth's infatuation for the Admiral was pretty obvious, and not good at concealing it. Thomas was now fretting in case Catherine blamed him, so he told Catherine that he had seen Elizabeth with her arms round a man's neck. The Queen was shocked, and when she confronted the Lady Elizabeth, she cried and denied it, begging Catherine to speak with her ladies. Elizabeth was hardly alone, and the only man she came into contact with, apart from her servants and tutors, was Thomas. Catherine could see how distraught Elizabeth was, and knew she must be telling the truth. But why would Thomas lie to her? Unless he was protecting himself. Catherine now realised what her husband had been up to. One day in April, Catherine realised that both her husband and her stepdaughter were missing. She went in search of them, and she found them alone together, with Elizabeth in Thomas's arms. As soon as they saw Catherine, they separated, but it was too late. Catherine had seen that both her husband and daughter had betrayed her. Elizabeth left the Seymours in May. Thomas made no attempt to see her go, but Catherine had. Her once warm and loving mother was cold. She merely said, "God has given you great qualities. Cultivate them always, and labour to improve them, for I believe you are destined by heaven to be Queen of England." Elizabeth kissed her and was gone, unable to bear Catherine's coldness. Elizabeth soon became ill, possibly grief-ridden, as she now saw that she had caused terrible hurt to the woman she called mother, and had potentially risked her reputation and her place in the succession. Thomas wrote to Elizabeth taking the blame, and swore to testify Elizabeth's innocence if necessary. But she responded telling him it was best if they didn't have any contact at all, and while Catherine was alive, he did just that. But this was in the July time, and Catherine died in September, so it wasn't really that long. After Elizabeth's departure, Catherine made an effort to forget what had happened and rebuild her broken marriage. Eventually, relations between her and her husband did improve, mainly by the shared pleasure of anticipating the birth of their child. Elizabeth wrote a letter to her stepmother, saying how truly I was replete with sorrow to depart from your highness. She signed the letter, Your Highness's humble daughter Elizabeth. It was undoubtedly a plea for forgiveness, and Catherine realised that Elizabeth had never intended her any real harm. She had lost her head over a handsome man who should have known better. Catherine wrote a warm reply, assuring her stepdaughter of their friendship. Elizabeth responded to Catherine's letter on the 31st of July, saying her letter was most joyful to me. I'm personally glad that the two were able to reconcile their differences, because Catherine Parr would ultimately die on the 7th of September 1548 from childbirth complications. Elizabeth and Mary grieved for the loss of their stepmother, who had always been kind and protective of them. Catherine had always acted as the mediator in the family, and her death would mark the beginning of a great divide between the sisters, who had once been close, but would now gradually grow ever more suspicious of each other, and end as formidable rivals in the dangerous arena of politics and religion. Thomas had lost the small amount of power that he had after Catherine's death, and was still trying to get his comeuppance on his brother, Edward Seymour, Lord Protector, who had more influence with their nephew than what he did. Thomas Seymour snuck into the king's residence and planned to basically kidnap his nephew.
Not a great plan.
Unsurprisingly, Thomas Seymour was arrested in the January of 1549 for conspiring to kidnap the king, for shooting Edward VI's dog, and for his despicable behaviour with Elizabeth finally came to light. Edward was suspicious of his sister, so the 15-year-old Elizabeth was interrogated about her relationship with Seymour, and if there was any truth about the rumour of Elizabeth and Seymour getting married. Elizabeth stood her ground and insisted that she had not been involved with Seymour's plans, and that there had been no discussion of marriage. She did, however, admit to knowing of Seymour's ambition, but she claimed that she never encouraged it. Kat Ashley, Elizabeth's governess, testified the incidents that we discussed earlier, about how Seymour would climb into Elizabeth's bed and tickle her. Kat Ashley said although some affection was unwanted, Elizabeth would blush at the mention of his name. Elizabeth herself refused to say anything that could incriminate her. After all, plotting to marry a princess of England, even if she's an illegitimate one, without getting permission from the Lord Protector, was treason. Thomas Seymour was found guilty of treason and was beheaded on the 20th of March 1549. Seymour protested his innocence on the scaffold. When Elizabeth heard that he had been executed, she said, "Today there died a man of much wit and very little judgment." Elizabeth's brother, King Edward VI, would die at the age of 15 on the 6th of July 1553. It was expected that her sister Mary would be queen, as Edward had no issue, but instead her cousin Lady Jane was queen. I imagine Elizabeth was confused, happy that a Protestant was on the throne again, but also angry because if Mary had been glossed over, then so had Elizabeth's claim, and potentially she was written out of the line of succession. Elizabeth was tactful and she stayed quiet. Mary ousted Jane from the throne on the 19th of July and was proclaimed queen. When Elizabeth heard, she rushed to London to swear loyalty to her sister. Knowing how much of a staunch Catholic she was, Elizabeth was preparing for a bumpy ride. Elizabeth had reached London on the 29th of July, just before Mary, and when Mary arrived on the 31st, Elizabeth rode out to the city gates to meet her sister. Mary had arrived with a full royal train, and relations between the two daughters of King Henry VIII had not always been friendly, but today it was all smiles, as the new queen raised her kneeling sister to her feet and embraced her. As the procession continued on its way towards London, the Lady Elizabeth felt like a princess, as she was in the place of honour immediately behind her sister, the Queen. Early in Mary's reign, she declared that Elizabeth was still illegitimate, and she went about reversing the Protestant reformations of her father and brother, bringing back a lot of the Catholic ways of worship. I believe that this actually would have had an effect on Elizabeth, because a lot of the Catholic ceremonies were glamorous and full of royal pomp and extravagance. Although Elizabeth would reign as a Protestant ruler, she kept a lot of the ceremonial pomp that came with Catholic ceremonies, and the same can be said about royal ceremonies today. Because if there's one thing that we love about royalty, it's the glamour that they bring. The UK was pretty much saved from a recession thanks to Queen Elizabeth II, because of the extravagance for her Platinum Jubilee in 2022, and again for her death and funeral in the same year, as it brought tourism and merchandising, and bank holidays so we could watch it. Right, let's get back to the OG Elizabeth. So, Mary started with her Catholic Reformation with the court. That meant everyone at court was supposed to go to Mass. Yes, Elizabeth, that includes you. Anne of Cleves and Elizabeth were the only two at court who stayed away from Mass, and Mary grew ever colder towards her sister. Elizabeth knew that she had to please Mary to stay alive, but if she went to Mass, her Protestant lords and allies may turn against her. So she blew hot and cold, sometimes begging Mary to send her teachers who would put her right on matters of religion, and sometimes bunking off so that the Protestants could see that she wasn't really serious. Mary knew that Elizabeth was just stringing her along. She didn't like her sister much now. She knew Elizabeth was more popular than she. But short of executing her, and she couldn't do that without a very good excuse, the only surefire way of scuppering Elizabeth was for Mary to have children. Mary had her coronation on the 1st of October 1553 at Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth once again took the place of honour, this time with Anne of Cleves. The two women shared an open chariot, which was richly arrayed with crimson velvet and a cloth of silver. They were also given new dresses that were made of a similar rich silver material, and in the procession to Westminster Abbey, they walked together directly behind the new Queen. The first 2 months of 1554 saw the Wyatt Rebellion. This was in protest of Mary's plans to marry Philip, Prince of Spain. The rebels wanted to depose of Mary and replace her with Elizabeth. This support for Elizabeth proved to Mary just how dangerous her sister was, and she summoned her sister to the Palace of Whitehall. However, Elizabeth claimed that she was too ill to obey her sister's summons. Mary wondered if Elizabeth had taken a page out of her book when it came to feigning illnesses to get out of stuff, so she sent 2 doctors to check if Elizabeth was faking. When they arrived, she was ill. She was pale and she was weak. The doctors, however, did say that she was well enough to travel to London if she travelled by litter. So, she travelled by litter to Whitehall Palace. Elizabeth, though protesting her innocence in the Wyatt affair, was imprisoned in the Tower of London for 2 months. Elizabeth's cousin Jane was also implicated in the Wyatt business and was executed on the 12th of February 1554. On her arrest in 1554, Elizabeth wrote to Mary, imploring her to ignore evil persuasions that would persuade not one sister against the other. Elizabeth's imprisonment at the Tower was comfortable enough, though. Physically, she was allowed in the gardens and had 4 rooms in the old palace. But this was also where her mother had spent her last days before her execution. But it wasn't too bad because she did get to spend some quality time with Robert Dudley. If you know, then you know. Robert Dudley was Guilford's brother, the husband of Lady Jane Grey, and was probably there just for good measure. Although in separate parts of the Tower, Robert and Elizabeth would have been allowed out for exercise together. As mentioned earlier, Elizabeth stayed at the same apartments where her mother had spent her last few days. Mary believed that Elizabeth was unloyal to her and Catholicism. Mary saw Elizabeth as illegitimate and she was interrogated several times, but she was strong in her denial of the involvement in the plot. Elizabeth's health wasn't good while in the Tower, and she had difficulty sleeping, but she kept herself composed, just as she had during the Seymour scandal. Elizabeth was innocent of conspiracy, and Mary had her released due to lack of evidence. Within 2 months, Wyatt had been beheaded and the investigation stalled. No evidence could be found of Elizabeth's involvement, and she was released on the 19th of May, the anniversary of her mother's death. But she would now be escorted to Woodstock, where she would be put under house arrest.
I'm watching you, Wazowski. Always watching.
Elizabeth spent the entire journey to Woodstock fearing for her own assassination, as this would get her out of Mary's way. without Mary being held responsible for her sister's death. However, Mary was childless and Elizabeth was her heir, so quite frankly, she was safe for now. Mary wed Philip of Spain on the 25th of July 1554 at Winchester Cathedral. Prior to the wedding, Philip was anxious to meet Elizabeth, as everyone had said she was more fun than Mary. He was probably thinking that he's marrying the wrong sister. Mary said no, but Philip kept insisting. See, Philip was also thinking about his own self-preservation. If Mary did manage to get pregnant, she might die in childbirth. Then Elizabeth would be queen. And Philip's father, the Emperor Charles V, was very anxious that she remain Spain's ally. Finally, Mary agreed and Elizabeth was brought to Hampton Court Palace. The two met on the 15th of April. Philip, to an extent, did actually help mend the sisters' relationship, and she did ask him to assure Mary that she had no part in the Wyatt rebellion, and because Mary was madly in love with her husband, she just took his word. Mary finally released Elizabeth from house arrest in August 1554. She was allowed to return to Hatfield, but she still did not trust her. Philip wanted to be sure that England was kept out of French hands, as the next heir after Elizabeth would be the Grey sisters or Mary Queen of Scots, who was married to a French heir. Philip had to keep Elizabeth alive and cultivated. In 1556, Elizabeth was summoned to court. Philip and Mary were convinced that they could get Elizabeth to convert to Catholicism if she had the right husband to manipulate her. They viewed her as very meek and easy to control, and Elizabeth would be a better heir than Mary Queen of Scots. Part 2 of Philip's cunning plan was for her to marry an ally of Spain, the Duke of Savoy. Elizabeth had been summoned to court and then ordered to marry the Duke. However, Elizabeth said no, and Mary threatened to lock her up in the tower again. It turned out to be only a threat. But Elizabeth was so scared that she wrote to the French ambassador asking if she could come and live in France. He told her that if she wanted to inherit the English throne, she would have to stay where she was. By November 1558, Mary had had 2, sometimes 1, depending on the sources, false pregnancies. Philip had run away to Flanders, and Mary's health was declining. Despite her best efforts, her only heir was Elizabeth. And on the 6th of November 1558, Queen Mary I recognised the Lady Elizabeth as her heir. Mary would then die on the 17th of November 1558. It is said that when Mary I died and the news was taken to Elizabeth, they say that she was reading in the garden. Elizabeth was happy when Mary died, and she said, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvellous in our eyes." Right, people who live in the UK, back me up in the comments section down below. She could not have been in the garden. I'm sorry, I do not buy that. Who sits in the garden in November in the UK? If you have ever lived in the UK during November, unless you are drinking, you do not sit in the garden because it is freezing. And you are not telling me that she had a ski jacket. Okay, she might have had some furs, but I doubt that was keeping her warm enough in a garden in November. I don't buy it. When Mary died, she left Elizabeth a will. She asked Elizabeth to become a Catholic, for the Spanish jewels to be returned to Philip, and Mary asked to be buried with her mother Catherine of Aragon, all of which Elizabeth didn't do. Elizabeth had a strong respect for the rights of kings and queens, even when they were enemies. Elizabeth didn't go to her sister's funeral, but she did make sure that Mary had a regal Catholic send-off. She didn't want to encourage disrespect for royalty. Elizabeth was clever. Her supporters were Protestants who hated flashy clothes, so during Mary's reign, Elizabeth wore black and white to please them. Mary was angry as she wanted her sister to wear rich materials and jewels. Elizabeth did as her sister wished, but only once Mary was dead, and Elizabeth herself was queen. Elizabeth became queen at the age of 25, the same age that another Elizabeth became queen. Right, not being funny, but I'll be proper miffed if we ever have a Queen Elizabeth III and she doesn't become queen at 25. Completely broke the pattern. Elizabeth's sister Mary had been queen until her death on the 17th of November 1558. Mary had reluctantly put Elizabeth as her heir as she was unable to conceive a child with her absent husband. Mary was a Catholic and was adamant that her subjects should be too, despite being told for the last 20 years or so that they were Protestants. As a result, England was a divided kingdom, thanks to Mary and the humiliating loss in Calais in January, which had knocked the confidence in England's military power and international reputation. When Queen Mary I died, their Catholic heir was Queen Mary I of Scotland, but she was married to a French prince, which is why the English Mary kept Elizabeth as her heir, because apparently for Mary being French was worse than being a Protestant. Mary, Queen of Scots' father-in-law, King Henry II of France, announced that Mary Stuart was the rightful Queen of England, not Elizabeth. However, this came at a bad time for the French, as a preacher called John Knox was leading a Protestant revolution in Scotland. Elizabeth didn't like John, but if it made things easier for her, then by all means. Knox and his sermons were turning Scottish nobles anti-French and anti-Catholic. In fact, the Scots wanted Elizabeth's help to fight the French. But Elizabeth had learnt two key lessons in her turbulent upbringing: say nothing or lie. She said nothing, but secretly, she sent money to help the Scots. On Christmas Day, Elizabeth went to church and saw Bishop Carlisle raise the hoist of communion bread high for all to see. This was the Catholic way, so Elizabeth shouted, "Lower that vessel at once!" In spite, the bishop raised it higher, so Elizabeth stormed out in an outrage. Because of this, Elizabeth struggled to find a bishop to crown her at her coronation. In the end, Bishop Carlisle agreed to coronate her. Also, fun fact, Elizabeth had asked her favourite astrologer, Dr. John Dee, to tell her the most favourable date for her coronation. He told her it was the 15th of January 1559. So, Elizabeth got coronated at Westminster Abbey on the 15th of January 1559. Her right to rule never really went unchallenged. Protestants couldn't cope with a female ruler, and Catholics viewed her as illegitimate. Elizabeth, like her sister, was very good at PR and had the Tudor rose embroidered into her coronation gown to show that she is the embodiment of a true Tudor. The city of London was alive for her coronation. Elizabeth had always been popular, and pageants had been put on in London for her honour. The citizens of London and crowds formed at Westminster Abbey to watch her leave her litter and enter the Abbey. The Countess of Lennox, Lady Margaret Douglas, was nearly knocked over in the crush as she carried the Queen's train. The Archbishop held the crown high over Elizabeth's head and pronounced her Queen of England. For the first time ever, the coronation oath is read from an English Bible. A cheerful Queen, in full regalia, carrying the sceptre and orb, chats to members of the congregation outside the Abbey. Elizabeth's coronation was a huge success. She enjoyed being out and about among the people, and they adored her. The only trouble was, she caught a bad cold and had to stay in bed for a few days afterwards.
It's funny because it's true.
In February, Elizabeth passes the Act of Uniformity, which is sometimes known as the Elizabethan settlement. Through this, she was trying to offer religious compromise, re-establishing the monarch as the head of the Church of England, but retaining the Catholic rituals in hopes of clearing up the mess that her sister had made in her short reign. Those who refused to attend Church of England services were forced to pay a fine of £1 a week, for not attending church on Sundays or holy days. In 1559, Elizabeth turned down at least 4 proposals. Seeing as she was known as the Virgin Queen and never got married, I can imagine her response was like this. The first proposal was from her brother-in-law, Philip. He wrote to her by letter and reminded Elizabeth of how supportive he had been while Mary was queen and how it was he that got her out of prison. He really just wanted to keep his hold in England, and Elizabeth was not impressed. She turned him down. A few months later, Philip started new negotiations with a French princess. Elizabeth wrote to Philip that he couldn't have loved her that much if he couldn't wait 4 months for an answer. Philip then became engaged to the French princess. Despite this, Philip and Elizabeth would remain friendly. That is until she starts to poke the bear. The second was Prince Eric of Sweden, who she rejected in the May. Eric was the eldest son of the King of Sweden and was a Protestant. He sent his handsome brother, Duke John of Finland, to woo her. Can we just take a minute to appreciate John's moustache? I mean, my God, look at that thing. It's just so majestic. They got on so well that people thought John and Elizabeth would wed. She turned Eric down, but that wasn't enough for him to get the message. 2 months later, he was writing to her that he would go through wind and storm to be with her. A year later, he did just that, and his fleet was blown apart. He had to turn back. Still, he wouldn't give up. In the end, Elizabeth said no to him 4 times. Then there was the King of Denmark, and his envoy had a pretty good idea.
Don't worry, Mr. B. I have a cunning plan to solve the problem.
He pranced around the court wearing a velvet doublet with a pierced heart on it. It didn't do him or his master any favours with Elizabeth.
Not a great plan.
And finally, Archduke Charles of Austria. Charles was the main contender, even if there was a bit of confusion. Charles was a relative of Philip II of Spain, Elizabeth's ex-brother-in-law, who was also trying for her hand. So the ambassador has to be wingman for both. In the end, the imperial ambassador pushed forward Charles. Elizabeth kept the Archduke Charles on a string for ages. One night, when the imperial ambassador was about to give up hope, he met the Queen in her barge on the river. The 2 barges drew alongside. Elizabeth invited him aboard. She played the lute to him and let him think that Charles was in with a chance. He wasn't really. In the summer of 1560, Elizabeth I had a problem. The Protestant lords that supported John Knox, the guy that Elizabeth was secretly funding, well, he was losing popularity, and there was the constant threat that France would aid the Scottish Catholics. To make matters worse, Mary, Queen of Scots, was calling herself the Queen of England.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity, and the gumption.
Mary was also using England's crest on her coat of arms. Elizabeth sent William Cecil to Scotland to ease tensions and to get the Scottish to sign the Treaty of Edinburgh, which stated that Mary, Queen of Scots, and her husband, the King of France, recognise Elizabeth as the rightful Queen of England, and that Queen Mary will stop using the English crest in her coats of arms. The treaty was signed by proxy in Scotland, but the monarchs in France refused to ratify the treaty. This would only be the beginning of the clash between queens. On the 8th of September, Amy Dudley, the wife of Sir Robert, died after falling down some stairs. Now, Amy's death is really mysterious and it's actually worthy of an episode all on its own, as it really does have the makings of a true murder mystery. So for now, I'm just going to summarise what happens and we can dig into the meat of these bones later. The TLDR, Elizabeth and Robert's affections for each other have always been obvious, and some thought the Queen might have been involved. As a result, Robert was now out of favour until it was ruled that Amy's death was accidental. But What it did mean was that any chance that the two had of getting together was now out of the question, thanks to the dark cloud created by Amy's mysterious death. Elizabeth would never go on to have children, and Mary, Queen of Scots, was indeed an heir to the English throne, but she wasn't the only one. The surviving Grey sisters, Catherine and Mary, had been at court under the monarch's watchful eye since their sister Jane usurped the throne for 13 days in 1553. Check out my other video on their sister Jane for more info. As Tudor princesses, it was illegal for them to marry without the consent of the monarch, in case they, the monarch, wanted to arrange political matches, which I'm sure Elizabeth had planned for the sisters. See, the thing is, Lady Catherine Grey had asked Elizabeth's predecessor Mary for permission to marry. Well, Mary was queen, and she had consented, but Mary never got round to signing the paperwork before she died. Lady Catherine Grey married Edward Seymour, Lord Hertford, nicknamed Ned, and I'm going to refer to him as Ned to avoid confusion. So they got married in secret in December 1560. Their sole eyewitness died in March 1561, which meant that Catherine was in real trouble when she became pregnant in the same year. Catherine, now Lady Hertford, concealed the marriage from everyone for months, even after she became pregnant. She knew that due to Mary's death, she had committed treason, and now in her 8th month of pregnancy in July 1561, she was desperately running out of time. Desperate, Catherine confided in Bess of Hardwicke, hoping she might help her with her case with the Queen. Bess refused to listen to Catherine and berated her for implicating herself. Catherine then went to Robert Dudley, who was kind of family if you squint and tilt your head, because his brother Guilford was married to Catherine's sister Jane. Visiting Robert's bedroom in the middle of the night, she explained her dilemma. As Dudley's room adjoined the Queen's chambers, he was afraid that they might be overheard, or that he might be caught with a visibly pregnant woman at his bedside, and he tried to get rid of Catherine as soon as he could. The next day, he told Elizabeth everything he knew regarding Catherine and her pregnancy. Catherine was then forced to reveal to her cousin, Queen Elizabeth, that she had secretly married Ned Seymour, Earl of Hertford, and that she was carrying his child. Ned had been sent abroad on a diplomatic mission by Elizabeth, and the heavily pregnant Catherine was left with no options. She was alone, and she must have been terrified. But she could no longer keep her marriage hidden. Catherine was sent to the Tower of London on the 5th of September, along with Ned, where Catherine then gave birth to their son, who they also called Edward, on the 21st of September. The baby was christened in the Tower on the 25th, and Elizabeth declared the marriage and the baby illegitimate, as they had no proof that they were even married, and therefore the baby was born out of wedlock as far as Elizabeth was concerned. The baby Edward was problematic, as from a certain point of view it could be seen as an attempt for the throne. After all, Catherine had a claim, and she had now continued the line with a male heir. Declaring the child as illegitimate was the most practical thing Elizabeth could have done for her own safety. And as Elizabeth dealt with one treacherous heir, another one returns to Scotland. Mary's husband died, and she is sent back to Scotland. Within days of arrival, Mary sent a representative to England to ask Elizabeth to acknowledge her as heir to the English throne.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity, and the gumption.
Elizabeth refused to acknowledge Mary as her rightful heir. She simply refused to name her as such for fears of plots and conspiracies. And can I just say that I think Elizabeth was right when we find out the amount of plots and conspiracies that went on. In the autumn of 1562, the 29-year-old Elizabeth contracted smallpox. It was fatal, and at one point it would look like that she would not recover. And, without an heir, another panic for the succession occurred. Many people, including the Queen's advisor Cecil, favoured the claim of Catherine Grey. Elizabeth recovered, although she would be scarred, but she realised the danger that Catherine posed to her throne, which wasn't helped when she fell pregnant for the second time in 1563. Elizabeth was always suspicious of such talk, remembering her days under Mary's rule, and once said, "So long as I live, I shall be Queen of England. When I am dead, they shall succeed that have most right." Elizabeth passed her smallpox on to her lady-in-waiting, Lady Sidney, the sister of Robert Dudley. Thankfully, she survived. Some of Elizabeth's ladies weren't so lucky. When Elizabeth thought she was going to die from smallpox, she asked the Privy Council to make Robert Dudley Protector of the Realm and to give him a suitable title. But that never happened, as the Queen thankfully recovered, so Dudley was made a Privy Council member instead. Despite being kept in separate cells, in February 1563, Catherine Grey gave birth to Ned Seymour's second child, Thomas Seymour, in the Tower of London. Right, seriously, Seymours, come on. There are other names in the world than Edward and Thomas. Okay, it just makes history so confusing when everybody is either named Edward Seymour, Thomas Seymour, or Jane Seymour. Honestly, go have a look. Sorry, rant over. It just stresses me out because it makes it difficult to figure out who's who. The Lieutenant of the Tower, Edward Warner, was a kind man and had allowed the couple to spend time together. He left certain doors unlocked and paid no attention to who passed through. Ned had to pay a fine for getting his wife pregnant. One must sympathise with Elizabeth, though. Not only had Catherine and Ned disdained and insulted the crown by their earlier offences, that was awful enough. But now they'd done it again? No remorse, no realisation of the enormity of their crime, just the same stupid, disrespectful behaviour. Elizabeth's patience, which she never did have lots of, was at an end. Elizabeth was very intelligent and conscious of her own position. She assumed Catherine must, at the very least, understand her position as well. Had she not learnt from her sister Jane's mistakes? She could not be so foolish and thoughtless as everyone argued in her defence. Everyone knew that actions have consequences. And so must Catherine Grey. Right, let's hop back to Elizabeth's other heir, Mary, Queen of Scots. She was looking for a husband again. This was not good. Elizabeth needed to try and sway her cousin to a match that wouldn't be a disadvantage for England. Originally, talks were opened with a match for Don Carlos, the son of Philip II of Spain.
What?
But Elizabeth made it clear that she would view this as a hostile act. Elizabeth tried to neutralise the threat by suggesting the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Arundel, and even her favourite Sir Robert Dudley. But Mary had eyes for Henry Stuart, the Lord Darnley, who was also a grandchild of Mary Tudor, so, like Mary, he had a strong claim to the English throne. Her suggestion of Robert shows how desperate Elizabeth was, because he was hers. In Elizabeth's head, Mary would give up living in Scotland and come live in England, in Elizabeth's court, so she could still be with Robert. But let's get real, that would never have happened. Mary at first inquired if Elizabeth was serious, wanting above all to know her chances of inheriting the English crown. Elizabeth repeatedly declared that she was prepared to acknowledge Mary as her heir only on the condition that she married Robert Dudley. Mary's Protestant advisers warmed to the prospect of her marriage to Dudley, and in September 1564, Dudley was created Earl of Leicester, a move designed to make him more acceptable to Mary. And how did Robert feel about this? He was horrified at the idea of being sent to Scotland. He looked thoroughly gloomy when the Queen knighted him in the September of 1564, and she shocked everyone by tickling his neck in the middle of the solemn ceremony. He needn't have worried though. Mary didn't want a man with rumours of murder hanging over him, and she wanted to marry Lord Darnley. Fortunately for Dudley, The marriage arrangement was called off in January 1565. Neither Robert or Mary was enthusiastic about the match, and despite Elizabeth agreeing to name Mary Queen of Scots as her heir, she couldn't actually bring herself to do it. Mary married her second husband, Henry Stuart Lord Darnley, on the 29th of July 1565, and she gave birth to their first child, James, at Edinburgh Castle on the 19th of June 1566. However, Darnley was not the nicest human being, and he conveniently died in a house explosion. After his wife Mary had witnessed him murder her friend Rizzio. 3 months after his death, Mary Queen of Scots married again on the 15th of May 1567 to James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. The marriage was unpopular, especially with Elizabeth. The marriage divided the country into two camps. When Elizabeth found out that Mary was planning on marrying James Hepburn, Elizabeth sent Mary a series of letters begging her not to do so. And I've got a snippet here from her letter. I exhort you, I counsel you, and I beseech you to take this thing so much to heart that you will not fear to touch even him who you have nearest to you, if the thing touches him. Praying the Creator to give you the grace to recognize this traitor and protect yourself from him as from the ministers of Satan. I wish as much good to you as my heart is able to imagine, or as you were able a short while ago to wish. Heartfelt recommendations to you, very dear sister. Elizabeth knew what a terrible effect marrying Bothwell would have on Mary's reputation. Here is another extract from the letter she wrote to her. No good friend you have in the world can like thereof, and if we should otherwise write or say, we should abuse you. For how can a worse choice be made for your honour than in such haste to marry a subject who, besides other notorious lacks, public fame, has charged with the murder of your husband? Elizabeth was right, and in the civil war that would follow, Mary was defeated, and instead of going to France, where she had friends and family, Mary decided to go to England, where she knew no one.
Not a great plan.
In what I can only describe as an incredibly stupid decision, the last thing Elizabeth needed was a Catholic cousin with a claim to the English throne gate-crashing her country. Things went south in Scotland, and Mary was forced to abdicate in favour of her son, James, who became King James VI of Scotland. Elizabeth was outraged. She sided with Mary. She believed that what the Lords had done was abhorrent. They had imprisoned and deposed an anointed queen, a crime against God that was even greater than Darnley's assassination months earlier. In Elizabeth's mind, nothing justified the action against Mary. Elizabeth's other heir, Catherine Grey, wasn't having a great time either, as she had fallen into a deep depression as she was being kept away from Ned, and she had refused to eat. And eventually, Catherine Grey died on the 26th of January, 1568. Some people believe that she died of a broken heart. Mary arrived in England on the 16th of May, 1568, by fishing boat. When Mary arrived, Elizabeth was torn. On one hand, she supported Mary's right as monarch to the Scottish throne, and found it hard to support those that would like to keep Mary off the throne. But she was also aware that the Earl of Moray, who was currently regent in Scotland, was supportive of English Protestant interests, and Mary's restoration would destroy all of that. Rather surprisingly, Elizabeth was all for helping Mary at first. Maybe it was to get rid of her, maybe not. One of Elizabeth's core beliefs was that kings and queens were sent by God to rule their subjects, and that subjects had no right to kick them out. Elizabeth's counsellors didn't agree. They thought Mary was guilty of murdering her second husband, and that Elizabeth should hand her cousin over to Mary's half-brother, Lord James Moray, who, was ruling Scotland with a Protestant coalition. An inquiry was held, but it ultimately proved nothing. So Mary was shut up in Tutbury Castle as a prisoner of the Queen. Elizabeth had spent the majority of her reign avoiding marriage proposals and putting out the flames of family members declaring their right as heir. One of her cousins, Catherine Grey, would die before she had the chance, and her other cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, was becoming more problematic, forever demanding to be named heir. Mary had escaped to England instead of France, and she was now a beacon of hope for the Catholics that lived in England. As a result, Elizabeth faced several plots and rebellions in her reign, and the first one we're going to look at is the Northern Earls Rebellion in early 1569. So when looking at these plots, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down into two sections, the plot and then Elizabeth's actions, and then I'm just going to talk a little bit more about it in general afterwards. Okay, so the plot. The Catholic Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland hatched a plan to get Mary Queen of Scots out of imprisonment and onto the throne. They gathered an army of 6,000 soldiers in their attempt to return England to Catholicism. Elizabeth's actions. Elizabeth got wind of the plan and sent a huge army to crush the rebellion. Elizabeth put 800 rebels to death and the two earls fled to Scotland. When the rebellion failed, the Pope got all excited about the prospect of potentially having a Catholic queen again, and excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570 to encourage more Catholics to rebel. The papal bull in 1570 specifically released Elizabeth's subjects from their allegiance to her, basically saying that she is not your queen and you can rebel. Also, in his bull of excommunication, Pope Pius V declared that Elizabeth should be deprived of her pretended title to the kingdom. This meant that any foreign prince was entitled to invade and take her throne, and he also freed all of Elizabeth's subjects from their oath of allegiance. He went as far to say that to support Elizabeth would lead to eternal damnation. The Pope also started encouraging Spain to invade England and replace Elizabeth with Mary Stuart, her Catholic cousin. Parliament and the Privy Council were outraged. They urged Elizabeth to clamp down on Catholics. It was the beginning of the end of Elizabeth's even-handed religious policy. From then on, Elizabeth was hard on Catholics, although nothing like as hard as her sister Mary had been on Protestants. The next year saw the Ridolfi plot. So the plot was, the Duke of Norfolk, Elizabeth's cousin, had fallen in love with Mary. He had fallen in love with her when he was chairing the inquiry. Elizabeth put him in the Tower because he was getting ideas about marrying Mary, and when she let him out, he was plotting with an Italian banker called Ridolfo and the Spanish Duke of Alva within weeks. Roberto Ridolfi planned to assassinate Elizabeth and make Mary queen. He had support of King Philip II of Spain, Elizabeth's cousin, the Duke of Norfolk, and obviously Mary, Queen of Scots. Norfolk felt unappreciated by the English Queen, and talks had fluttered about him marrying Mary ever since she arrived in England. So the plan was for him and Mary to marry once she was free, to strengthen her claim over the English throne, regain the Scottish throne, and then elevate Norfolk's power. Mary denounced her ties with the French and openly embraced that of Catholic Spain. Elizabeth's actions? Well, the plot was uncovered by Elizabeth's chief advisor, William Cecil. Ridolfi was expelled from the country, and Norfolk was executed as a result. After the Ridolfi plot, Elizabeth had to acknowledge Mary as a threat and placed her in stricter custody. At first, Elizabeth refused to sign the death warrant for the Duke of Norfolk, as she hated executing people, especially those that she knew well. However, her guilt wouldn't hold out for long, as the Duke of Norfolk was beheaded on the 2nd of June 1572. She has got a bit of a habit of accidentally executing family members. Wonder where she got that from. Feeling like she needed an ally against Spain and the threat of Mary, Elizabeth entered marriage talks in late December with the then Duke of Anjou, who later became King Henry III of France. Nothing came of this marriage, and Henry would go on to marry Louise of Lorraine. Despite inheriting her grandfather's frugality and spending far less money than her father, England was broke. Even cutting her allowance at court wasn't helping, as Elizabeth was still spending more money than she was bringing in. She wasn't in favour of raising taxes, as that would upset her subjects, and the only time Parliament would justify raising tax was in the case of war, and Elizabeth wasn't a fan of war. Enter pirateer Francis Drake.
Hello there.
Unlike Jack Sparrow,
There should be a captain in there somewhere.
Francis Drake was a pretty good pirate, good enough to gain a knighthood from the Queen and to enrage the Spanish king he was robbing from. Elizabeth got on well with these sea captains. There are others, but the most famous was Sir Francis Drake, and they were mainly Protestant. The sea captains were loyal to her, and they were always up for an adventure. Drake made the Queen rich and captured a huge haul of gold and jewels which the Spanish had discovered in the New World, but he brought it back to England. Elizabeth invited him to meet her as she wanted to know all about his travels. Also that year, the Protestants in the Netherlands had begun a revolt against the Spanish rule. This became known as the Dutch Revolt. Elizabeth secretly supported the Dutch rebels because she knew the Dutch revolt would keep the Spanish too busy to threaten England. The Netherlands were ruled by Spain, but the English saw the Netherlands as a vital place for trade. By 1572, Protestant ideas had spread in the Netherlands, and Protestant Dutch rebels began a campaign for independence from the Catholic Spain, leading to the Dutch Revolt. King Philip of Spain sent an army to defeat the rebels, following the death of the Dutch rebel leader, William of Orange, not the same William of Orange that became King of England. I think it's like his grandfather or something. Elizabeth was approached to become Queen of the Dutch. She declined, but sent an army to fight with the Dutch against Spain. Throughout the 1590s, the Dutch won several victories against the Spanish, and by 1609, after Elizabeth's death, the Dutch Protestants had won control of Holland. In 1574, Elizabeth sent more family members to the Tower. Margaret Douglas requested to take her surviving son up north to visit Scotland. On their journey north, mother and son stayed with Bess of Hardwicke, and it was here where Charles, Margaret Douglas's son, would meet and fall in love with his future wife, Elizabeth Cavendish, who produced Arbella Stuart, another family member with a claim to her throne. The marriage and child were arranged secretly by both Margaret Douglas and Bess of Hardwicke. Having none of this, Elizabeth demanded that both women come to London. Upon their arrival, Elizabeth sent both Margaret Douglas and Bess of Hardwicke to the Tower. This time in the Tower, Margaret frequently wrote to Mary Queen of Scots and sent her a gift of lace made from her own white hairs.
Gross.
The year after Elizabeth's favourite, Robert Dudley, threw a 19-day pageant at Kenilworth Castle to persuade Elizabeth to marry him. She couldn't realistically say yes, no matter what her heart might have felt, and at which point Dudley moved on, and he would marry Elizabeth's relative, Lettice Knowles, on the 21st of September 1578, much to her annoyance. Elizabeth's favourite pirate begins his voyage around the world in 1577, and he wouldn't return until 1580. Elizabeth went into business with Drake and invested lots of money in his latest expedition to the New World. Walsingham, Robert Dudley, and Sir Christopher Hatton were also investors, and Drake set off around the world. Elizabeth also opened up trade between England and the Barbary states, which was namely Morocco as well as the Ottoman Empire, in 1578. As another move to spite the Spanish. By the November of 1578, King Philip of Spain was getting rather annoyed at Elizabeth and her sea captains, so she realised it might be a good idea to get herself an ally, maybe a French prince. Elizabeth had initially begun talks with the Duke of Anjou back in 1571. However, he was now married and the King of France, so she looked to his younger brother, Francis, the Duke of Anjou, and Alison. He was available, and in 1578 he sent over his smooth-talking courtier to suck up to Elizabeth, Jean de Seymour. Jean de Seymour was a dodgy character. He had just murdered his brother, but he was a real charmer, and he soon had the whole court talking about how close he was with Elizabeth. Not everyone was against Seymour, despite the murder. William Cecil, Elizabeth's chief counsellor, who was now Lord Burleigh, was very keen on a French marriage, and an heir who would see off Mary, Queen of Scots. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, on the other hand, was very gloomy at the thought of the Queen marrying. The Duke of Anjou was in fact the only one of Elizabeth's foreign suitors to court her in person. He was 24 and Elizabeth was 46. Despite the age gap, the two soon became very close. Elizabeth dubbed him her frog. While a few believe this nickname arose from a frog-shaped earring he'd given her, let's be honest, frog has been an unflattering slang nickname for the French for centuries. Many were horrified at this relationship because he was a Catholic. The summer of 1579, we think, is when Elizabeth found out about Robert Dudley marrying Lettice Knowles. Elizabeth was dealt the crushing blow of Dudley's betrayal. She herself was actually engaged in negotiations for a potential marriage with the Duke of Anjou, but that did not make the news any easier to swallow. So incandescent with rage was she that her initial reaction was to send Dudley to the Tower, a punishment he was thankfully spared, thanks to the intercession of the Earl of Sussex. Nevertheless, he retired from court in disgrace, leaving his new wife Lettice to bear the brunt of the Queen's fury. Elizabeth was furious, and her counsellors pointed out that it wasn't actually against the law for an unmarried man to marry. Leicester was saved from the Tower, although he was told to stay at home for a bit, and when Lettice Dudley showed up at court in her best gear, Elizabeth boxed her ears and said, "As but one sun lights the east, I will have but one queen in England." She never had a good word to say for Lettice, and called her the she-wolf. Over the course of the next decade, the Queen would react poorly towards any hint of the couple's closeness, and it does seem that despite the pressure of royal displeasure, the couple were happily married. Spurred on by her heartbreak, Elizabeth made a big play for Francis. The first step was to see him in person. Usually princes and dukes refused point blank to come to England to be looked at like prize ponies, but Anjou wasn't fazed. Anjou was called back to France at the end of August when a friend of his was killed in a duel. By the time he reached home, he had sent Elizabeth 7 letters. In one he wrote, "If your majesty will consent to marry me, you will restore a languishing life, which has existed only for the service of the most perfect goddess of the heavens." Elizabeth liked her men to talk to her like this. She was quite taken with Anjou, and she wrote a poem about how she felt. In October 1579, marriage negotiations were now underway. However, Elizabeth's counsellors put their feet down about some of the terms proposed by the French. They weren't prepared to crown the Duke of Anjou King of England immediately. He'd have to wait until after the coronation, and they were not prepared to give him an income of £60,000 a year. Parliament also hated the idea of their queen marrying a Frenchman. The idea of a marriage to a Catholic Frenchman was even worse, and it was very unpopular with many of Elizabeth's Protestant subjects. And in the November of 1579, it really did look as if Elizabeth might actually marry. I feel like Elizabeth must have looked back at when Mary married Philip. That marriage was extremely unpopular, and the Wyatt rebellion happened as a result. Could she be facing the same thing if she also went through with this unpopular match? So instead of pushing ahead, she asked her counsellors what she should do next. When they came down against the marriage, she burst into tears. The next day they came back, very contrite, and said that they would do anything if it would make her happy. Elizabeth and the Duke of Anjou saw each other on and off over the next few years. Anjou was fighting on the Protestant side in the Netherlands, and he wanted Elizabeth to back him. On one occasion, they appeared together on a balcony, and Elizabeth announced that she was really going to marry him. She kissed Anjou on the lips, took a ring from her finger and gave it to him. Technically, it was official that they were engaged, but then the very next day she called him to her privy chamber and said that she could not marry him. Rather than cause unrest, the Queen's virginity became an unlikely source of unity, a defiant symbol of her virtue and sacrifice. Portraits of Elizabeth became loaded with symbolism borrowed from the Virgin Mary or from the chaste classical goddess Diana. And like a goddess, Elizabeth's appearance in art remained ever youthful. Loyal supporters wore her image as a badge, courtiers gushed their admiration in poetry, and the wider country celebrated in festivals and pageants. Elizabeth was married to England. In 1580, Francis Drake returned home from his world voyage.
Look what I got. I got a jar of dirt.
Being a much better pirate than Jack Sparrow, Drake returned with £800,000 worth of stolen treasure, not to mention some sample potatoes and a tobacco plant, and tales of strange creatures called llamas. Drake gave Elizabeth a crown that had 5 emeralds in it, which she wore the following New Year's Day. He was knighted the next year as a result for all of his presents to the Queen. Elizabeth couldn't afford war with Philip, but she was determined to weaken his power by providing support in the Netherlands and get her pirates to rob his. Despite having changed her mind about her frog, the Duke of Anjou was still in England, and by December 1581, she wanted to get rid of him so badly that she paid him £10,000 just to get rid of him. I'm going to show you a picture now from the National Archives website showing you just how much that would roughly be in today's money. Robert Dudley was charged with escorting the Duke of Anjou to Holland. Elizabeth was nearly 50 by the time it was finally over with Anjou. There was now no question of her ever producing a baby. The person with the best claim to succeed her was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was still stuck in prison. Mary's arrival in England had destabilised Elizabeth's control over her country. If you remember, Pope Pius V had excommunicated Elizabeth just after Mary arrived in England back in 1570, and this meant there were always some Englishmen who felt it was their duty to get rid of Elizabeth from the throne of England. But now, the Pope went even further. He said, "There is no doubt that whoever sends that guilty woman out of the world with the pious intention of doing God's service not only does not sin, but gains merit." It was an open invitation to English Catholics to kill the Queen and put Mary on the throne. November 1583 saw the Throckmorton plot. The plot? A young Catholic man, Francis Throckmorton, organised a plan for a French army to invade England and replace Elizabeth with Mary, which was paid for by King Philip II of Spain and the Pope. Elizabeth's actions? Throckmorton was executed and Mary was moved to Tutbury Castle in Staffordshire, where she was held in isolation and was allowed no visitors. The unravelling of the Throckmorton plot, also to replace Elizabeth with Mary, led to the creation of the Bond of Association and the Act of Security of the Queen's person in 1584. Mary, though not specifically named, was now responsible for future plots instigated in her name. Sir Francis Throckmorton was tortured on the rack, a form of torture that left victims crippled for life. Throckmorton gave nothing away the first time round, but the thought of a second session on the rack was too much for him, and he told Walsingham everything he wanted to know. This is how Elizabeth learned that Philip II of Spain was planning the Enterprise of England, a Catholic crusade to conquer England and put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. Throckmorton was hanged at Tyburn and the Spanish ambassador kicked out, but Elizabeth's Parliament and Council were seriously worried by the Throckmorton plot. They thought that Mary, Queen of Scots, should have been among those executed, but Elizabeth wouldn't hear of it. Perhaps she remembered how she herself had been the centre of every plot going when her sister was queen, whether she liked it or not. Maybe she simply didn't want to create a Catholic martyr. Whatever the reason, even though she was often angry at Mary, she said there was no real proof against her. This wasn't good enough though for Francis Walsingham, who was determined to catch Mary.
Don't worry, Mr. B. I have a cunning plan to solve the problem.
Francis Walsingham set out to entrap Mary. Pretty soon he had proof that Mary was in league with all sorts of people, which included the banished Spanish ambassador and the French ambassador. They were in league with various English Catholics, including an eager young man called Sir Anthony Babington. Babington was so confident that his plot to murder Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne would succeed that he had his portrait painted with his fellow conspirators.
Not a great plan.
The last plot against Elizabeth that we're going to look at today is the Babington plot, which took place in July 1586. The plot? Sir Anthony Babington planned to rescue Mary from jail and murder Elizabeth. Secret letters between the plotters and Mary were discovered, which gave the evidence needed to prove Mary's guilt. Elizabeth's actions? This finally led to the execution of Mary, Babington, and 6 other plotters. As a likely successor to Elizabeth, Mary spent 19 years as Elizabeth's prisoner, because Mary was the focus for rebellion and possible assassination plots, such as the Babington plot. Mary was also a temptation for potential invaders, such as Philip II of Spain. In a letter to Mary in 1586, Elizabeth wrote, "You had planned to take my life and ruin my kingdom. I never proceeded so harshly against you." Walsingham uncovered this plot by Anthony Babington. Mary's correspondence was under surveillance. Mary had addressed the letter to Babington, apparently endorsing the plot. Sir Francis Walsingham sent spies to Mary's prison, pretending to be her servants. When Mary sent a letter to Anthony Babington, the servants took it to Walsingham first. Mary tried writing in code, but she sent Babington the code, which meant that Walsingham had a copy. This would be the final plot to put Mary on the throne and would ultimately be her downfall. Thanks to the incredible spy work of Walsingham, Mary was moved to Fotheringhay Castle in North Hampshire in October 1586, where she was tried for treason. Elizabeth was banking on Mary pleading guilty and begging for forgiveness, which would allow Elizabeth to pardon her cousin and in turn save her life. But Mary refused the right of commissioners to try her. She argued against the legality of the trial and maintains that, as a foreign anointed queen, she had never been an English subject and thus could not be convicted of treason. Don't you just love loopholes? Shame it didn't work though. Mary was found guilty, having compassed and imagined the hurt, death and destruction of the royal person. Despite unrelenting pressure from Parliament and her councillors to carry out Mary's sentence, Elizabeth hesitated to order the execution. In her eyes, Mary remained a legitimate sovereign, and she was concerned that killing her would set a dangerous precedent. Although I would argue that she wasn't, as she was forced to abdicate. Mary was put on trial, and it was clear that she had been plotting against Elizabeth. The only card she had to play was that no court in England had the right to try the Queen of another country. In English law, every man had the right to be tried by his equals. This meant that if you were an earl or a duke on trial, you had the right to a jury of earls and dukes. They were your peers, and this is where the word peer, meaning lord, comes from. This tradition also meant that a monarch could never be tried because 1. He didn't owe any loyalty to anyone else, so he couldn't commit treason, and 2. He had no peers who could judge him. Although unfortunately, King Charles I wasn't so lucky on that first one. Despite the law, Mary was tried by a court full of English peers and councillors. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. The councillors were determined to have Mary's head. They were done with Elizabeth making excuses. Sir John Davison slipped the warrant in among a lot of other papers she had to sign, so she could pretend that she didn't notice what she was signing. The death warrant was handed to William Cecil as soon as she signed it, so she couldn't change her mind. The death warrant had been signed on the 1st of February 1587, and Mary was beheaded a week later, on the 8th. Elizabeth changed her mind after signing the death warrant, but her councillors had carried out the sentence without her knowing, although I find that extremely hard to believe. Like, yeah, alright, Elizabeth, who are you kidding? Mary was executed, her head severed in 3 blows. When Mary was executed, her head was supposed to be lifted high in the air by the executioner to prove that she was dead, but Mary was wearing a wig. When he grabbed it, the head slipped out and bounced on the floor. Mary was dressed in black. When the time came, she removed her black dress to reveal a red petticoat. She slipped on red sleeves. She wore red so the blood wouldn't show, and she wore a turban round her head to keep her hair out of the way of the axe. But then I feel like that contradicts the wig story, so again, I don't know how much of this is actually fiction and how much is fact. I mean, I know the fact that her head was chopped off, that was definitely fact. and her eyes were bound with a white cloth trimmed with gold. The axeman's assistant held her body still while the axe fell. It missed her neck and cut into the back of her head. The second chop was a much better shot, but it still needed a bit of sawing with the axe to finish it off. Mary's pet dog, a Skye Terrier, had slipped into the hall under the cover of her skirts and was still hiding there when the head was off. It finally came out whimpering. It is said that the dog refused to eat and pined away and died. To be honest, the bit with the dog, the whole thing kind of sounds like a romanticisation of her beheading. Bit like with Jane Grey fumbling for the block. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. Mary's heart was removed and put in a glass jar.
Got it!
The English didn't want any of that Robert the Bruce nonsense with loyal Scots following a heart into a battle. The heart was buried in the castle grounds. Mary had asked to be buried in France. She was actually buried in Peterborough. I mean, I've heard that Peterborough looks just like France in the summer, right? In 1612, her son King James I of England had her coffin moved to Westminster Abbey. Her heart still lays buried in the grounds of Fotheringhay Castle, where she was executed. Elizabeth was furious when she found out that the execution had already happened. The council pleaded with Elizabeth, claiming they wanted to spare her the pain of having to order Mary's death. Elizabeth claimed her advisors had betrayed her wishes. Elizabeth might have been genuinely distraught by the execution, but it was already too late, the minute that she'd signed the death warrant, quite frankly. Elizabeth did apologise to Mary's son, James.
I'm sorry.
In her letter to James, she wrote, "My dearest brother, I want you to know the huge grief I feel for something which I did not want to happen, and that I am innocent in the matter." James accepted the apology, but the Spanish, not so much. In all honesty, I think James mourned less than what Elizabeth did. But that's for another time. After ordering the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, her adoption of mourning clothes, and pretense that the decision hadn't been hers, was an act of self-pitying hypocrisy worthy of her father. Mary had been involved with the Babington plot, which planned to kill Elizabeth and replace her with the former Scottish Queen. As a result, Elizabeth accidentally signed her cousin's death warrant, and the Scottish Queen was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. Elizabeth wrote to Mary's son, King James VI of Scotland, and told him,
I'm sorry.
He was fine. But the Spanish, not so much. And we're going to be looking at some of the consequences of Elizabeth beheading Mary Queen of Scots. As it turned out, the consequences weren't as serious as Elizabeth had feared. The English Catholics pled loyalty to Elizabeth. Scotland, as briefly mentioned earlier, didn't really care, as now King James VI was now Elizabeth's potential heir. France still wanted an alliance with England, as they were scared of the mighty Spain, and Spain was already warring with England over the pirating and the Dutch revolt, so her death had very little effect. What it did do, though, was give King Philip II of Spain a reason to attack England. In July 1588, Elizabeth knew that the Spanish Armada was coming. Philip had been plotting against England for years. His first plan of trying to marry Elizabeth failed. His plan of trying to replace Elizabeth with Mary Queen of Scots had failed, and Sir Francis Drake and the other English sea captains were rubbing salt in his wounds by stealing his treasure. He also believed that he needed to help free the English Catholics, but the English Catholics didn't want a Spanish king ruling them any more than the Protestants did. People still remembered the terrible days when Philip had been married to Mary. It was Philip that had encouraged the burnings, not Mary. Now Mary Queen of Scots had been executed, he had a cast-iron excuse to march in, depose Elizabeth, and avenge her death. He planned to send an armada, which is Spanish for large fleet, you're welcome, to put the English navy out of action, so that the Spanish troops could cross the Netherlands in other, smaller ships and conquer England. Philip had planned the armada for 2 years, and it pained him that Elizabeth was on the throne without him as consort. Not saying that he was in love with Elizabeth, but if she was on the throne, then realistically, if his first plan had worked, he would be ruling it too. And that's what he wanted, the kingdom, not Elizabeth. Philip at this point was 61 and Elizabeth was in her 50s. Soon after departing from Lisbon, Spanish ships had been damaged. Men had diseases and food had gone rotten, all before leaving. They had to stop at Corona in northern Spain for repairs. The commander of the fleet wrote to Philip telling him what had happened and that the men are weak. But Philip wanted the attack to go ahead as planned. They planned on sailing up the Channel, meeting with a Netherlands force led by the Duke of Parma in Dunkirk, who were to be ferried across in barges to invade Kent. The Armada would protect that fleet as they went on to England. It is claimed that Sir Francis Drake stood on Plymouth Hoe playing a game of bowls, and when he was interrupted to be informed about the arrival of the Spanish fleet, he said, "Time enough to play the game, and thrash the Spaniards afterwards." And he was determined to finish his game of bowls before dealing with the Armada. However, this is a lie. He did not play bowls at the arrival of the Armada. All accounts of Drake playing the game were written years after the event.
You sit on a throne of lies.
Meanwhile, English troops had been gathering at Tilbury in case the Duke of Parma landed from the Netherlands. Elizabeth decided that she would go and meet the men who were going to defend their country. Not everyone thought she should go. They were worried about her safety. What if a Catholic was among the troops? Would they take a shot at her? Elizabeth had long since forgiven Robert Dudley for his marriage to Lettice, and he was now in command of the troops at Tilbury. That was the real reason she was going. The Spaniards now had to make it up the Channel. Some of their ships crashed into each other, and an explosion lost them 2 ships. The Navy intercepted the Armada in the Channel, and Drake took one of the Spanish ships, the Rosario. While at Tilbury, Elizabeth made an infamous speech that would inspire the English for centuries, and it's even used by our lionesses. The story of the Armada and Elizabeth's speech at Tilbury is used to inspire our little island in times of need. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too, and think it foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than any dishonour shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarded of every one of your virtues. That last bit meant that she would pay the troops. As far as monarchs go, Elizabeth had a better record than many rulers on this. But she didn't pay them, despite saying she would in her speech. In the original story, the Queen's speech starts off the attack. The English set fire to 8 ships of their own and launched them towards the Armada. In a panic, they cut rank, and some ships collided. Then the wind drove the ships northward and then sailed. But yeah, Elizabeth actually made her speech 11 days after the fire ships, and after the Armada had been won. The men also were sent home as the Queen couldn't afford to pay their wages. They never actually got a chance to fight as the bad weather destroyed most of the Armada and the Spanish retreated. Elizabeth had come up with the plan to address the troops with her infamous speech while the Spanish were still in the Channel. Yet by the time she arrived at Tilbury, the Armada were already staring defeat in the face. 11 days earlier, English fire ships had attacked the Spanish fleet while it was waiting off France for its rendezvous with Parma's army. These burning vessels caused the Spanish to panic. So, when Elizabeth uttered her famous words at Tilbury, what was left of the Armada was on its way home, running up around Scotland and Ireland to get back to Spain, so basically just doing a loop of the UK to turn round. The sources don't even mention the famous heart and stomach of a king line until more than 3 decades after the event. It was first introduced by a Protestant chaplain who had been at Tilbury. although it does kind of sound like something that Elizabeth would say. Gales prevented the capture of the Spanish ships, which were driven north, and they limped home round the north of Scotland. Many ships were wrecked, hundreds of Spaniards drowned, and only half the Armada returned to Spain. Not a single English ship had been lost or taken. So, basically, we beat the Spanish because of bad weather. Sounds about right. Despite beating the Armada, Elizabeth's ongoing struggle against Spain was costly and unsuccessful, leaving a large debt to her successor. The crown threatened prison for those who were bold enough to claim that they had not been paid. By the end of 1588, more than half of the men who had fought against the Armada had died from disease and starvation. The Spanish Armada is often depicted as this invincible navy, but it was tiny really. There was 103 Spanish ships versus 34 English ships, Elizabeth and some private ships for extra. The Norman invasion fleet of 1066 and the French force that crossed the Channel and sunk the Mary Rose in 1545 had more ships than the Armada. Here in England, we see the Armada story as a great underdog story, a victory against the evil Spain. But the Spanish never really saw the Armada as a significant setback. Elizabeth was too poor to pay those who had fought for their country, and the English Admiral Lord Howard wrote, "The sailors cry out for money, and know not when they are paid. I have given them my word and honour that I will see them paid. If I had not done so, they would have run away from Plymouth in their thousands." So, what were the consequences of the Spanish Armada? Well, the defeat did not harm Philip's control over his empire, which continued to grow after his death in 1598, and Spain would remain a dominant superpower for a further 100 years. Philip tried other armadas in 1596 and 1597, but both of them, again, were destroyed by bad weather, although I guess more specifically this time storms. England took it as a sign that God was on their side, even celebrating a national day of thanksgiving for its victory over Spain on the 24th of November. Elizabeth's reputation as Gloriana peaked. The Armada also meant that England was able to continue causing trouble for the Spanish Empire, and the pirates continued to attack Spanish treasure ships. On the 4th of September 1588, the Queen's favourite and one true love, Robert Dudley, died at Cornbury Park near Oxford. Dudley's health had not been good for some time. Historians have considered malaria and stomach cancer as causes of death, but his death still came unexpectedly. Elizabeth, unsurprisingly, was deeply affected and locked herself in her apartments for a few days and refused to speak to anyone until Lord Burleigh had the door broken. Elizabeth kept the letter he had sent her 6 days before his death in a bedside treasure box for the rest of her life. It was marked with "his last letter" in Elizabeth's handwriting. However, don't think for 1 minute that in her grief Elizabeth would be kinder to her cousin Lettice. No! Her grief did not make her any more sympathetic to poor Lettice, Robert Dudley's widow. Dudley had died owing the Queen a loss of money, and Elizabeth wanted it back. She made Lettice auction her furniture to pay the debt, as well as taking back a house that she had given Robert. All this, despite the fact that Dudley had left Elizabeth a spectacular necklace of 600 pearls to add to her vast collection of jewels. Elizabeth wore Dudley's necklace for the portrait that was painted to celebrate the English victory over the Armada. Elizabeth was more popular than ever after the Armada, and she had finally earned the respect of her own councillors. Lord Burleigh declared, "She is the wisest woman that ever was, for she understands the interests and dispositions of all the princes in her time, and is so perfect in the knowledge of her own realm that no counsellor she has can tell her anything she does not know before. Even the new Pope was a fan. She is a great queen, and were she only a Catholic, she would be our dearly beloved daughter. Just look how well she governs. She is only a woman, only mistress of half an island." Rude. "And yet she makes herself feared by Spain, by France, by the Empire, by all. I wish I was free to marry her. What children we would have. They would have ruled the world. All right, Pope, calm down. In the November, Elizabeth was still milking the success of the Armada, which had happened in the July, and held a victory parade through London. England and Elizabeth had an inflated ego, so we launched the Counter Armada, also known as the English Armada,
Real original.
in May 1589. Now, I'm going to give my English viewers a heads up, as you know we don't like discussing battles that we lost. So, if you're English, I suggest skipping this section so you don't get triggered or end up having a stroke because you've learnt that we've actually did lose a battle. Sir Francis Drake led the counter-attack on Spain with the hopes of finishing the original Spanish Armada once and for all, and to invade Portugal, which was under Spanish rule, and put a Portuguese king on the throne. But the counter-armada failed. The counter-armada suffered twice as much as the Spanish did in the original Armada. The victory of the counter-armada was not as important to Philip as the victory of the original Armada was to England. The defeat of the counter-armada was downplayed. A defeat our history wants to forget. Drake and his fleet were forced into making a stop at Corona for lack of provisions. A local woman, Maria Pitta, led a fierce resistance against the English navy. Still celebrated as a heroine in Corona, Pitta is said to have killed an English soldier herself, thereby inspiring the town to victory. 15,000 Englishmen and many of the 86 ships were lost. Elizabeth was getting old now, by Tudor standards anyway, and having witnessed the death of Robert Dudley in 1588, she would see the deaths of two other people that were close to her. The next one would be Blanche Perry, Elizabeth's royal servant right from the time Elizabeth was a child. She died blind on the 12th of February 1590, and the next death was on the 6th of April 1590. Elizabeth's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, died. Walsingham had engineered the downfall of Mary Queen of Scots by providing evidence of her treason against Elizabeth. William Cecil Lord Burleigh was also getting on too. He wanted to retire, but Elizabeth wouldn't allow it. But she did allow him to sit down on a stool in her presence. Usually everyone had to stand or kneel when she was in the room. Although I was watching History After Dark the other day, and they were talking about Queen Elizabeth I. And I really like what Dr. Katrina Marchant said. And she's also got a YouTube channel called Reading the Past, which I highly recommend to anybody that loves history. Like, Dr. Kat's videos are chef's kiss. Like, I love her. I think she's really funny, and I really respect her work on YouTube as well. So please go support her, go subscribe, go watch her videos. But anyway, on History After Dark, she said that Elizabeth preferred to work her council to death rather than execute them, which I thought was quite funny because actually she's got a fair point there.
It's funny because it's true.
Point in case, Lord Burleigh. Elizabeth had banned her godson, Sir John Harrington, from court in 1585 for disgracing himself by making rude remarks to her ladies-in-waiting. However, he managed to win back her favour in 1591 by inventing a flushing toilet, which he called an Ajax. Elizabeth travelled to Kelston Hall to try his Ajax, and loved it so much she invited him back to London to install his invention in all of her palaces. As a result, Queen Elizabeth I was the first monarch in current Britain to have a flushing toilet. However, it would be another 200 years before the idea caught on. Prior to this, Tudor palaces and great houses had little rooms called jakes. Sorry to any viewers called Jake. The waste from the jakes weren't washed away, but instead fell into a pit. With hundreds of people living in a palace, these pits soon filled up. It was actually pretty disgusting. The pits had to be opened. They were then shoveled up and carted away. The smell would hang around for weeks. That's why Tudor monarchs had 3 or 4 palaces that they could move around to. Tudors used a communal damp rag for toilet paper, as it could be rinsed and reused.
Gross.
As always, I am presenting you highbrow history. On the 28th of January 1596, Sir Francis Drake lay dying. The West Indies legend has it that he ordered his magical drum back to England and swore he would return to his homeland. The drum was taken back to Plymouth, where it remains today, and the drum beats out its own warning when the country is in trouble. The drum is said to have rattled when Napoleon Bonaparte was brought to Plymouth after the Battle of Waterloo. It also sounded in 1914 when World War I started. The last time the drum sounded was during the Battle of Dunkirk in World War II. If you would like a video on Sir Francis Drake and his drum, then let me know in the comment section down below. On the 4th of August 1598, Elizabeth had finally worked her senior advisor, William Cecil, to death, and he passes his political mantle to his son, Robert Cecil. Robert Dudley at this point had been dead for several years, and the Queen was in need of a new favourite. Enter Robert Devereux.
Hello there.
Dudley's stepson and Letitia's son from her first marriage. In 1599, Robert Devereux was a bit of a scoundrel during a period of war, the 9 Years' War to be exact. He failed to defeat his Queen's Irish enemies and would instead make peace without her consent. And he went about knighting people, something he had no right nor power to do.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity, and the gumption.
This rightfully enraged Elizabeth. Robert Devereux was also the Earl of Essex, and his greatest failure as Lord Lieutenant is the same as lieutenant for the American viewers. It's spelled exactly the same, but it's just pronounced as lieutenant. I think lieutenant makes sense, and that's probably one of the few times I'll actually agree that the American way of doing it is probably better. But he was Lord Lieutenant, so when I say that, that's what I mean. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex's greatest failure as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a post which he talked himself into in 1599, was the 9 Years' War. The 9 Years' War was in its middle stages and no English commander had been successful. More military force was required to defeat the Irish chieftains led by Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, and supplied from Spain and Scotland. Lieutenant Devereux led the largest expeditionary force ever sent to Ireland, 16,000 troops, with orders to put an end to the rebellion. He departed London to the cheers of the Queen's subjects, and it was expected the rebellion would be crushed instantly. But the limits of the Crown's resources and of the Irish campaigning season dictated otherwise. Essex had declared to the Privy Council that he would confront O'Neill in Ulster. Instead, he led his army into southern Ireland, where he fought a series of inconclusive engagements, wasted his money, and dispersed his army into garrisons, while the Irish won 2 important battles in other parts of the country. Rather than face O'Neill in battle, Essex entered a truce that some considered humiliating to the Crown and to the detriment of English authority. The Queen herself told Robert that if she had wished to abandon Ireland, it would scarcely have been necessary to send him there. Ooh, burn! In all of his campaigns, Robert Devereux secured the loyalty of his officers by conferring knighthoods, an honour the Queen herself dispensed sparingly, and by the end of his time in Ireland, more than half the knights in England owed their rank to him. The rebels were said to have joked that he never drew sword but to make knights. But his practice of conferring knighthoods could in time enable Essex to challenge the powerful factions of Cecil's command. Robert Devereux had none of the charisma, uniqueness, nerve or talent that his stepfather Robert Dudley did. Nor did he apparently have the brain cells. In September 1599, Robert Devereux burst in on the Queen while she was getting dressed, a breach of protocol and privacy. As Elizabeth got older, it took her 4 hours a day to get dressed and undressed, so that's 2 hours on, 2 hours off. She wore wigs throughout to cover up her aging face, and she wore white lead, peruse and vinegar on her face, neck and hands. Beeswax and plant dye paste on her lips and her eyes were lined with kohl. The young, pretty Elizabeth had aged into a balding, frail woman with black, rotten and foul-smelling teeth, scarred by pox, crippled by headaches, and plagued by bouts of depression. Elizabeth's cosmetics were dangerous. The Earl of Essex infamously burst into the Queen's chamber before she was dressed or made up. He was so shocked at her haggard appearance, he joked about her crooked carcass to his friends. Upon hearing this, Elizabeth chopped off his head, although to be fair, he did start a rebellion against her as well in 1601. Due to his failure in Ireland and his attempted rebellion to usurp the throne in 1601, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was arrested. The Queen's once fondness saved him from being hung, drawn and quartered. Instead, he was beheaded. Both Devereux's mother, Lettice Knowles, and sister, Penelope Rich, appealed for his freedom. But Penelope is said to have written such an arrogant letter that it ruined the appeal to the Queen. Elizabeth expected Robert to plead for his life, but he didn't, and so she signed the death warrant. On the 25th of February 1601, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was beheaded in the confines of the Tower of London and buried there in the Church of St. Peter ad Vincula. At his own request, Essex had a private execution. On the scaffold, he swore he had never wanted the Queen's death or intended to lead a coup. 1601 is also the year Elizabeth gives her golden speech to Parliament. There is no jewel, be it of never so high a price, which I set before this jewel, I mean your love. Until Henry VIII broke from Rome, Parliament had been an occasional event. Elizabeth had planned to keep it that way. However, tensions grew as the Queen's debts started mounting, thanks to the war in Ulster. Elizabeth treated her Parliament to a golden speech, thanking them for their love of her, and she assuring her love to them, which they all bought and she was forgiven. High taxes, bad harvests, unemployment, stagnant wages, inflation and crime created discontent, and Elizabeth's popularity waned. Her golden speech had temporarily renewed her popularity. On the 25th of February 1603, Elizabeth's close friend and cousin, Catherine Carey, Countess of Nottingham, died at Arundel House. This came as a blow to Elizabeth. Catherine had held the post of Lady of the Bedchamber to Elizabeth I until her death, dying only a few weeks before the Queen herself. Elizabeth paid the expenses of the funeral for her cousin. After 46 years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth I died on the 24th of March 1603 at Richmond Palace. All of Elizabeth's leading councillors and courtiers were agreed at this point that King James VI of Scotland was the rightful heir to the English throne. I mean, not true, but whatever. Robert Cecil had been in secret communication with King James for years, yet Elizabeth herself had never come out and said James was her successor. Now, as she lay dying on her cushions in front of a fire, her councillors tried for the last time to get an answer from her. Troubled me no more. Who else but my cousin Scotland? It was at last definite. Her councillors were ready. It was important that James received the news and came to London as quickly as possible to forestall a Catholic coup. 7 strong, fast horses were ready at 50-mile intervals up the Great North Road. Sir Robert Carey, Elizabeth's cousin, dressed for a long, cold ride, sat astride his own horse beneath the window for the Queen's withdrawing room. In the early hours of the morning, his sister, Lady Philadelphia Scrope, also Elizabeth's cousin, and her lady-in-waiting, appeared at the Queen's bedroom window and silently dropped the sapphire ring from Elizabeth's finger down to him. The Queen had drawn her last breath. Sir Robert caught the ring and was off, riding to Scotland. He covered the 400 miles to Edinburgh in 3 days. James, King of Scots, was now James I of England. Many people speculate this part of the story to be a myth. I have a feeling it might be, but I can say I enjoy it. I enjoy the theatrical side of this. Queen Elizabeth's funeral was on the 28th of April 1603, and she was buried at Westminster Abbey with her sister Queen Mary I, and they share a tomb, probably against both of their wishes. Chronicler John Stow reported at her funeral, "There was such a great general sighing, groaning and weeping, as the like hath not seen or known in the memory of man." The lead coffin containing the Queen's body was drawn by 4 horses decked in black. Covered in purple velvet, there was a life-size effigy on it of the Queen, in her robes of state and royal crown. 6 earls carried a canopy to protect the coffin. Then came the Queen's master of horse, leading her favourite palfrey. Many people wept when they saw the familiar horse without its rider. Next, dressed in black, came the chief mourners, led by the Marchioness of Northampton, Helena Snakenborg/Parr, Helena Parr. All the ladies of the court and many peeresses of the realms walked behind the coffin, through the streets to Westminster Abbey. Behind them walked 260 poor women, 4 abreast. It was rumoured that Arbella Stuart, or Arabella Stuart, depending on which version you prefer, was supposed to be the chief mourner. However, she refused to undertake the role and King James had not yet arrived in London, hence why Helena Parr did it. And I'd like to end this episode on John Stow's full eyewitness account. Westminster was surcharged with multitudes of all sorts of people in the streets. Houses, windows, leads and gutters that came to see the funeral, and when they beheld her statue lying upon the coffin, there was such a general sighing, groaning and weeping, as the like hath not been seen or known in the memory of man. Neither doth any history mention any people, time or state, to make like lamentation for the death of their sovereign. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. If you'd like to watch another of my videos, then may I suggest my video on Elizabeth's parents, King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn? Or what about her predecessor to the throne, Queen Mary I? At this point, I have no idea what we will be exploring next time, as I haven't decided. But until then, have a wonderful day.